There is a place on this earth where the silence is so complete, so absolute, that you can hear your own heartbeat, where the red dirt stretches to every horizon without interruption, without mercy, without end, where the sky is so vast and so ancient that standing beneath it feels less like looking up and more like falling forward into something incomprehensibly old. This is the Australian Outback, and for most of recorded history, the people who built their empires of stone and steel and scholarship in other parts of the world looked at this place and saw nothing. Empty, barren, a red wound on the surface of the earth with nothing worth finding, nothing worth studying, nothing worth knowing. They were wrong. They were so spectacularly, so profoundly wrong, that when the truth finally began to surface, when the evidence started climbing out of the red earth and demanding to be seen, it did not merely revise what we thought we knew about Australia. It did not simply add a footnote to a chapter of a textbook somewhere. It cracked the foundation of everything we believe about the human story, about when we arrived on this planet as thinking, creating, wondering beings, about how far we traveled, how early we traveled, and what we carried with us into the darkness of a world that had never heard a human voice before. What scientists found buried in the Australian outback has shocked the entire world, and tonight we are going to talk about all of it. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is, because I check those comments and it never stops being extraordinary to me. Someone in Perth at midnight, someone in Toronto watching the snowfall, someone in Manila in the early morning hours before the city wakes up. All of us, in all of our different time zones, connected by curiosity about this ancient, strange, astonishing world we were born into. Drop your location in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let us begin. The Outback covers approximately 1.5 million square kilometers of the Australian continent. That is a number that sounds large in the abstract, but does not fully land until you try to understand it spatially. You could fit the entire nation of Mongolia inside the Australian Outback and still have room left over. You could stack the combined land areas of France, Germany, Spain, Italy, and the United Kingdom into that red expanse and watch them disappear without a trace. It is vast in a way that challenges the imagination, and it is old. Not old in the way that European cities are old, with their medieval cathedrals and their cobblestone streets worn smooth by 1,000 years of footsteps. Old in a geological sense, in a deep time sense. The rocks of the Australian outback are among the oldest exposed formations on the surface of the planet. Some of them formed more than 3.5 billion years ago, when the Earth itself was barely a quarter of its current age, when the atmosphere was still toxic to almost every form of life that exists today, when the oceans were full of iron, and the sky was a color nothing alive today has ever seen. For a very long time, Western science treated the outback the way it treated most things it did not immediately understand. It categorized it, it labeled it, it drew lines around it on maps and moved on. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia, whose ancestors arrived on this continent somewhere between 50,000 and 65,000 years ago, had been living in intimate relationship with this landscape for longer than any other human culture on Earth has been anywhere. But their knowledge, their oral traditions, their understanding of this land, these things were not treated as data. They were not treated as evidence. They were not treated as the profound scientific resource they actually are. That was a mistake that would take generations to begin correcting. The correction began not with a single dramatic discovery, but with a slow accumulation of evidence, each piece stranger than the last, each one pointing toward a history of this continent and the people who first inhabited it that was far older, far richer, and far more world-altering than anyone had dared to suggest. Let us start at the beginning. Or rather, let us start at what we used to think was the beginning. For most of the 20th century, the accepted timeline of human arrival in Australia placed the first people here somewhere around 40,000 years ago. This was itself a remarkable claim at the time it was first proposed, because 40,000 years ago predates the construction of the pyramids at Giza by more than 35,000 years. It predates the invention of writing by nearly 34,000 years. It predates the founding of the earliest known cities by more than 30,000 years. So, even the old conservative estimate was pointing towards something extraordinary. The Aboriginal Australians were not a young culture. They were not a recent arrival. They were, even by the most cautious reckoning, the oldest continuous living culture on the surface of the earth. But then the dating started getting older. Sites that had been excavated and studied began to be re-examined with new techniques, with optically stimulated luminescence dating, and uranium-thorium series analysis, and other methods that allowed researchers to push their measurements back beyond what radiocarbon dating could reach. And what they found consistently, site after site, region after region, was that the evidence kept stretching backward 50,000 years. 55,000. The Majid Bebi rock shelter in the Northern Territory, when re-excavated and redated in 2017, produced evidence of human occupation going back at least 65,000 years. 65,000 years. To put that in perspective, 65,000 years ago, Neanderthals were still alive in Europe. The entire history of what we call human civilization, every empire, every city, every alphabet, every scientific discovery, every war, every cathedral, every poem, every symphony, every invention, every everything, all of that fits inside a window of roughly 12,000 years. The Aboriginal Australians were living on this continent for more than 5 times that entire span before a single brick was ever laid anywhere else on Earth. That alone should have rewritten the textbooks. That alone should have caused a fundamental reorientation of how we understand human history. But what came next went even further, because it was not just when they arrived that started to surprise researchers. It was what they left behind. Deep in the ancient rock formations of Western Australia, in the Pilbara region, there is a concentration of rock art so dense, so intricate, so technically sophisticated, that the first researchers to study it seriously simply could not believe what they were seeing. The Murujuga rock art, also known as the Burrup Peninsula engravings, contains more than 1 million individual petroglyphs, 1 million, carved into the ancient red and orange rock with a patience and a precision that speaks to an artistic tradition of extraordinary depth. Some of these engravings depict animals. Kangaroos and echidnas and birds are common, but there are also images of creatures that no longer exist in the Australian landscape. Thylacines, the Tasmanian tigers that vanished from mainland Australia around 3,000 years ago. Megalania, the giant monitor lizard that grew to 7 meters in length and went extinct around 40,000 years ago. There are images of fauna so archaic that their presence in the rock art implies these engravings were made before these animals disappeared, pushing the dates of some of the Murujuga carvings back tens of thousands of years. But there is something else at Murujuga that stops researchers cold when they first encounter it. Among the realistic animal depictions, among the hand stencils and the human figures, and the abstract geometric patterns, there are images that do not fit, images that resist easy categorization, figures that appear to show individuals wearing what look like structured headdresses or helmets, figures and poses that suggest ceremony or technology, arrangements of symbols in rows and grids that look less like art and more like early notation systems, like attempts to record something in a repeatable, transmissible form. Nobody is claiming these are alien inscriptions. That would be both lazy and wrong. But what researchers are increasingly arguing is that these images represent a level of abstract symbolic thinking, of deliberate communication through visual marks, that pushes the origins of symbolic cognition much further back than we previously believed. And it raises a question that does not have a comfortable answer. If human beings were capable of this kind of sophisticated abstract representation 60 or 70,000 years ago in Australia, what does that tell us about the cognitive capacity of our ancestors far earlier than we assumed? The implications do not stay contained within the borders of Australia. They ripple outward, they reach across the Pacific, they reach into the Americas, they reach back into Africa and across Asia. They touch every story we have ever told about ourselves as a species, about where we came from and what we could do and when we learned to do it. And this is where the story of what scientists found in the Australian Outback becomes something much larger than Australian history, because the Outback, it turns out, has been hiding more than one secret. Let us talk about the underground lakes. Beneath the surface of the Australian continent, in particular beneath the vast flat interior of the Nullarbor Plain and the deeper geological formations of Central Australia, there is water. Not just a little water, a staggering, almost unbelievable amount of water, locked in aquifer systems that were formed during periods of the Earth's history when the Australian interior was wet, when rivers ran where only dust blows now, when the red centre of the continent was green. The Great Artesian Basin is one of the largest and deepest freshwater reservoirs in the world. It underlies approximately 22% of the Australian continent. It has been accumulating water for millions of years, and in geological terms, it is a time capsule. The water at the deepest levels of the Great Artesian Basin fell as rain more than 2 million years ago. It filtered down through the rock slowly, over impossible spans of time, and it has been sitting there in the dark and the silence ever since. When researchers began drilling into these formations and analyzing what came up, they found more than water. They found organisms, microbial communities living in the deep, ancient water, isolated from the surface world for so long that they had evolved in complete independence. Bacteria and archaea adapted to a world of no light, no seasons, no contact with the surface biosphere. Some of these organisms process chemicals through metabolic pathways that have not been seen anywhere else on Earth. Some of them appear to represent evolutionary lineages that diverged from their nearest relatives millions of years ago, during periods when the Australian continent was in a completely different position on the globe, when its climate was unrecognizable, when the life that lived on its surface would look to a modern eye like something from another planet entirely. This is extraordinary for its own sake, but it becomes something more when you add it to the other pieces of the puzzle. When you start to understand that the Australian continent has been serving as a kind of biological and geological archive for the entire duration of life on Earth, that the things buried there, the things preserved in its ancient rocks and its deep water and its long unbroken living traditions, represent a record of life on this planet that exists nowhere else. Australia separated from the other southern continents roughly 45 million years ago. Since then, the evolutionary story of life on this continent has unfolded largely in isolation. The result is a biosphere unlike any other on Earth, not just different in the surface level sense of having unusual animals, though the fauna of Australia is genuinely bizarre by global standards, different in a deep structural sense. The evolutionary relationships between Australian species tell a story about the origins and diversification of life that fills in gaps in our understanding of the history of the entire planet. When scientists find something extraordinary in the Australian outback, they are not just finding something about Australia. They are finding something about all of us, about all of life, about all of Earth's history. The continent itself is the discovery. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us bring the story back to human history. Let us talk about what was found in the Earth. In the 1990s, near the shores of Lake Mungo in outback New South Wales, researchers made a discovery that would take years to fully understand. The remains of an individual, a woman who had been cremated and buried with care, were found in the sediments of what was once a thriving lakeside environment. This was not the first burial found at Lake Mungo. Another set of remains, known as Mungo Man, had been found earlier and was already recognized as among the oldest human burials in the world. But the woman, known as Mungo Lady, pushed things further. Her cremation, the deliberate burning of the body, followed by the crushing of the bones and their careful burial, is the oldest known example of human mortuary ritual anywhere on the planet. She was buried roughly 42,000 years ago. Think about what mortuary ritual implies. It implies a concept of death as significant, as a threshold, as an event that requires acknowledgement and ceremony. It implies beliefs about what happens after death, or at least feelings about it strong enough to organize collective action in response. It implies social bonds, community, the understanding that an individual's passing matters to the group. It implies symbolic thought, the capacity to invest action with meaning that goes beyond immediate practical consequence. Mungo Lady was not just a woman who died, she was a person whose community gathered and made choices and performed acts that only make sense in the context of a rich inner life, a culture, a set of beliefs about the world. And she was doing this in Australia 42,000 years ago. The oldest known burial in Europe at the time of the Lake Mungo discoveries was roughly 30,000 years old. The oldest known burial in the Middle East was roughly 15,000 years old. The oldest known burial in the Americas was roughly 12,000 years old. Mungo Lady was older than all of them, by a margin so wide that it shifted the entire center of gravity of the story of human cultural development. Australia was not a backwater. Australia was not a dead end. Australia was, if the evidence can be trusted, one of the primary crucibles of human cultural sophistication. The people who arrived on this continent tens of thousands of years ago were not fleeing something or wandering aimlessly. They were navigators, they were thinkers, they were builders of culture. And they arrived early, and they thrived, and they left a record in the earth that is only now beginning to be read with the seriousness it deserves. But the Lake Mungo discoveries were only one thread in a much larger tapestry. Around the same time that researchers were beginning to understand the depth and complexity of the record at Lake Mungo, other researchers were beginning to examine something that had been hiding in plain sight for a very long time. The stone structures of the Australian outback, not rock shelters, not natural formations, deliberate constructions. Stone arrangements that cover enormous areas of land, that demonstrate planning and knowledge and intention, that have been sitting in the red dirt of inland Australia for so long that nobody who came from outside thought to look at them carefully. And even when they were noticed, even when they were mapped and measured and photographed, the instinct of many researchers was to find the simplest possible explanation for them. To say they were natural, or that they were casual and temporary, or that they were something other than what the Aboriginal Australians themselves consistently said they were. Because the Aboriginal Australians had always known, the knowledge had always been there, in the oral traditions and the ceremonial life and the custodianship of the land that had been maintained for 65,000 years without interruption. These structures were not a mystery to the people whose ancestors built them. They were a mystery only to those who arrived from elsewhere and lacked the frameworks to understand what they were looking at. One of the most striking examples is in the region known as the Pilbara, in the same broad area where the Murujuga rock art is concentrated. Here, spread across the landscape, are stone arrangements of a scale and complexity that demand explanation. Long lines of carefully placed rocks extending for hundreds of meters, circles and spirals and geometric patterns that are only visible in their full form from the air or from high ground. Arrangements that align with astronomical events, with the rising and setting of particular stars, with the solstices and equinoxes, with the movements of celestial bodies, that the builders of these structures clearly watched carefully over long periods of time. This is not unique to Australia. Stone arrangements that track astronomical events are found on every inhabited continent. Stonehenge in England, the alignments at Karnak in France, the medicine wheels of the North American Great Plains, the sekes of the Inca in South America, the ancient stone circles of West Africa. Everywhere that human beings have lived for long periods of time, they have built structures that encode their observations of the sky. But the Australian examples are among the oldest, and they are connected to a body of astronomical knowledge preserved in the oral traditions of the Aboriginal peoples that has been recognized by researchers only in recent decades as being genuinely sophisticated, genuinely accurate, and genuinely ancient. The Yolai people of New South Wales, for example, have oral traditions about the Milky Way that describe it not as a river of light, but as a system of dark regions and bright regions with specific names and specific astronomical meanings. The dark patches in the Milky Way, which modern astronomy recognizes as areas of dense interstellar dust, are seen in ULI tradition as animals and figures with their own stories and their own significance. This is not metaphor. This is systematic observation. The dark constellations of Aboriginal Australian astronomy were mapping real features of the night sky in ways that Western astronomy did not formally recognize until the 20th century. The Yolngu people of Arnhem Land have oral traditions that track the movements of Venus with a precision that matches modern astronomical measurement. They describe the relationship between the moon and tides with an accuracy that Western science only formalized in the 17th century with the work of Isaac Newton. The Burong people of Victoria have astronomical traditions that include the identification of specific star clusters and their relationship to the seasonal availability of food sources, a practical application of astronomical observation that represents both scientific accuracy and sophisticated ecological knowledge. These were not lucky guesses. This was the accumulated product of tens of thousands of years of careful, systematic observation of the night sky by people who had every reason to pay close attention. The movements of the stars told them when to travel and where. They told them when particular animals would be breeding and when particular plants would be fruiting. They told them about coming changes in the weather and the seasons. The sky was their calendar, their map, their almanac, and the knowledge encoded in their traditions about the sky is so precise, so detailed, so consistently accurate that when modern astronomers began studying it seriously, they found things in it that they could not explain as anything other than long, careful, rigorous observation. One astronomer, working with Aboriginal knowledge keepers in South Australia, found references in oral tradition to a nova, a stellar explosion, that appears to have occurred roughly 2,500 years ago. The details in the oral tradition match what modern calculations predict the event would have looked like from the ground. If the oral tradition accurately records something that happened 2,500 years ago, then it was preserved and transmitted with remarkable fidelity across roughly 100 generations of storytellers. That kind of cultural transmission, that kind of continuity and accuracy across deep time, is itself a form of technology. It is a form of knowledge preservation that Western culture, with its emphasis on written records and institutional memory, does not have a clear parallel to, and it raises a question. If the oral traditions of the Aboriginal Australians can accurately preserve information about astronomical events that happened 2,500 years ago, what else might they be preserving? What else, encoded in story and ceremony and song, might be waiting to be recognized as the scientific data it actually is? Some researchers believe the answer to that question is extraordinary, because in Australia, the oral traditions are not just old, they are demonstrably, verifiably ancient. There is a class of Aboriginal oral traditions that describes landscapes, not abstractly, not poetically, but with specific geographic detail. Stories that describe particular bays, particular rivers, particular features of the coastline. And when researchers began systematically comparing these landscape descriptions with the geological record of how the Australian coastline has changed over time, they found something that should not have been possible. The stories were accurate, not approximately accurate, not generally accurate, specifically, geographically, demonstrably accurate about coastlines that have not existed above water for more than 7,000 years. 7,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, sea levels around Australia rose dramatically as the great ice sheets of the northern hemisphere melted. Coastlines that had been dry land for tens of thousands of years were inundated. Entire landscapes were swallowed by the rising sea, and the oral traditions of the Aboriginal peoples who had lived on those landscapes before the sea rose, the traditions they told about those places, those traditions survived. Passed from generation to generation, from parent to child, across more than 300 generations, the memory of a drowned world was preserved. This is not mythology in the dismissive sense of the word. This is oral history. This is cultural memory functioning as a form of deep time archive, preserving accurate geographic information across an interval of time that no written record anywhere in the world can match. When this was recognized, when the papers were published and the evidence was laid out, the scientific community was genuinely astonished, because it was proof of something that had seemed nearly impossible. That human cultural transmission, the passing of knowledge through story and song and ceremony, could function with sufficient fidelity to preserve specific factual information across 7,000 years, across 300 generations. If this is true for geographic information, the question becomes inescapable. What else is preserved? What else is encoded in the traditions of the oldest continuous culture on Earth, waiting to be recognized by researchers willing to take it seriously enough to look? Let us talk about the tools. In the middle of the 20th century, archaeologists working at various sites across the Australian continent began to notice something strange in the stratigraphic record. There were layers in the earth that told a story of human occupation across deep time. And in those layers, at the levels corresponding to periods between roughly 4,000 and 8,000 years ago, they kept finding the same thing: new tool types, tools that had not been present in the layers below them. Small, finely crafted stone tools with particular shapes and particular flaking patterns that represented a distinct technological tradition, a way of working stone that was different from what came before and different from what existed on the continent at the time of European contact. This was interesting, but not necessarily shocking. Technology changes over time. New tool traditions replace old ones. That is expected. What was unexpected was the question of where these new tool types came from, because the techniques used to make them, the particular forms of pressure flaking and backing and geometric microlith production, were techniques that are found elsewhere in the world. They are found in India, they are found in parts of Southeast Asia, they are found in areas of Africa. And their appearance in Australia in the archaeological record roughly 4,000 to 8,000 years ago raised a possibility that archaeologists spent decades trying to either prove or disprove. Were there people coming to Australia from elsewhere during that period? Was there contact between the continent and the wider world in an era that predates any European knowledge of Australia by thousands of years? The genetic evidence, when it finally became available with sufficient resolution to address the question, was illuminating. Studies of the genomes of Aboriginal Australians published in the second decade of the 21st century found traces of genetic material with links to populations in South Asia. The signal was ancient, not recent. It was not the product of contact in historical times. It dated, in the estimates of the researchers who analyzed it, to somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, around the same time that the new tool traditions appeared in the archaeological record. Something happened 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. There was contact, there was movement. People came to Australia from somewhere to the north or northwest, and they brought with them both their genes and their technology. and then they integrated into the existing population. They did not replace it, they did not overwhelm it. They blended into it, leaving traces that a geneticist could find tens of centuries later by reading the molecular archive encoded in the cells of their descendants. This is not the most dramatic finding in Australian archaeological history. It does not require a complete rewriting of the textbooks, but it matters because it tells us that Australia was not isolated in the way we sometimes assume it was. Even before European arrival, even before the great age of sail and empire, there were currents of human movement connecting the Australian continent to the rest of the world. The Outback was part of a larger human story even in its earliest chapters. But the genetic findings from the early 21st century held another surprise, one that went in a different direction entirely, one that did not speak of contact from outside, but of ancient divergence within. Because the Aboriginal Australians, when their genomes were analysed at sufficient depth, turned out to be carrying something extraordinary. They were carrying, within their DNA, evidence of a divergence from the rest of the human family tree that dated back to the very earliest period of modern human expansion out of Africa. The ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians appear to have been among the very first groups of modern humans to leave the African continent, among the very first to take the route along the southern coast of Asia, among the very first to reach the eastern edge of the world that was then accessible by land. And when they reached Australia, they stayed. While other populations continued to move, to diversify, to mix with other groups and with archaic human relatives like Neanderthals and Denisovans, the ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians settled in and did not leave. Their genetic lineage, relatively unmodified by later admixture, has been accumulating in Australia for 65,000 years, which means that in a very real sense, the Aboriginal Australians are the living representatives of one of the oldest surviving human genetic lineages on the planet. Their genomes are a window into the earliest chapters of the story of modern human expansion, and buried in those genomes is something that nobody expected: evidence of interbreeding with a third archaic human relative, one that is not Neanderthal and not Denisovan, one that has not yet been identified from any fossil record, a ghost population, known only from the genetic signal its admixture left in the genomes of the people it interbred with, an unknown human. The discovery of Denisovans had already been a shock. They were known only from a finger bone and some teeth found in a cave in Siberia. But their genetic impact was found in populations scattered across Asia and Oceania. The idea that there might be yet another archaic human relative, one that we have not found fossil evidence for, one that interbred with the ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians on their journey to the continent, was something that the researchers who first identified the signal described with a carefully restrained scientific language that nonetheless barely concealed their astonishment. There is someone we have not met yet, someone in our family tree, someone who walked the earth alongside our ancestors tens of thousands of years ago, who met them and who left traces in the DNA of people alive today, and whose bones we have not yet found. The Outback and the people who have lived in it for 65,000 years may hold clues to who that unknown someone was. Because if the admixture happened somewhere along the route from Africa to Australia, somewhere in South or Southeast Asia, and if the only surviving genetic signal of that event is in the genomes of the descendants of those who completed that journey, then finding more about the unknown archaic relative may require looking in places that have not yet been thoroughly searched. Ancient sediments, cave systems, the deep geological record of the regions between Africa and Australia. Australia did not just receive the story of human migration, it preserved it. In the DNA of its people, in the sediments of its ancient lake beds, in the ochre on its cave walls and the engravings on its ancient rocks, it preserved a record of humanity's earliest chapters that exists nowhere else on Earth with such completeness or such depth. And we are only beginning to read it. Let us talk now about one of the most controversial, most challenging, most potentially world-rewriting discoveries ever made in the Australian Outback. Let us talk about the Bradshaw paintings. In the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia, on the vertical faces of ancient sandstone cliffs that have been standing since long before the first human ever set foot on the continent, there are paintings, not the bold geometric shapes that characterize much of the rock art of the Outback's interior, not the hand stencils or the simple animal outlines that are most commonly associated with ancient Australian rock art. These are something different. The Bradshaw paintings, named after the European pastoralist who first described them to Western audiences in 1891, are known by the Ngarrindjin people who have always been their custodians as Gwion, are among the most technically sophisticated and most mysterious works of ancient art found anywhere on Earth. They show human figures, elaborate, detailed, highly stylized human figures in complex poses, wearing what appear to be structured garments and ornate headdresses, depicted in scenes of ceremony and dance and activity that convey a sense of sophisticated social life and aesthetic culture. They are beautiful in a way that is genuinely difficult to describe. The figures have a grace and a dynamism that feels modern, that feels as though it could have been made yesterday by an artist who had studied the human form with deep attention and then found a way to capture movement and vitality in a few precise lines. And yet they are ancient, very, very ancient. Dating the Bradshaw paintings has been extraordinarily difficult. The paintings themselves cannot be directly dated with most standard techniques, because radiocarbon dating requires organic carbon, and the mineral pigments used in the paintings do not contain it. But the wasps that build their mud nests on the rock walls, sometimes over the paintings and sometimes under them, do contain organic material. And by dating the wasp nests that overlie the oldest paintings, researchers have established that the Gwion figures are at least 17,000 years old. Some estimates push the oldest examples back much further, to 40 or even 50,000 years ago. 17,000 years ago, at the absolute most conservative end of the estimate, the artists who created the Bradshaw paintings were painting human figures of extraordinary complexity and sophistication, while the woolly mammoth still walked the plains of Europe and Asia, while the ice sheet still covered much of the northern hemisphere, while the world was a colder, harder, more forbidding place than it is today. And the figures they were painting were wearing clothes. Structured, decorated, clearly intentional clothing. Not rough animal skins draped for warmth, but garments that suggest a tradition of textile production and personal adornment. An aesthetic culture in which the way you presented yourself to the world through what you wore was something that mattered, something worth encoding in art that would outlast you by tens of thousands of years. This is extraordinary by itself. But it is the identity of the figures, the debate about who they are and where the tradition that produced them came from, that has made the Bradshaw paintings genuinely controversial in the deepest sense of that word. Because some researchers have argued, based on the stylistic characteristics of the figures, that the Gwion represent a cultural tradition that has parallels in other parts of the ancient world, that the conventions used to depict the human form, the ways the figures are posed and ornamented and set in relation to each other, suggest connections to artistic traditions found elsewhere in the ancient world in ways that cannot be easily explained by independent invention. This is a claim that requires extraordinary evidence and that many researchers reject. The history of attempts to find external origins for aspects of Aboriginal Australian culture is a troubled one, deeply entangled with the racist assumptions of colonial scholarship that sought to explain everything impressive about Aboriginal culture as the product of outside influence rather than Indigenous achievement. The idea that sophisticated Aboriginal art must somehow have come from elsewhere is precisely the kind of idea that did tremendous harm and that serious scholars are rightly cautious about. But the question of the Gwion is not going away, and the most careful researchers in the field are not arguing that the tradition came from somewhere else. They are arguing something more subtle and more interesting. They are arguing that the Gwion tradition may represent a very early flowering of a kind of artistic sophistication that is itself part of what it means to be a fully modern human being. That the impulse to depict the human form in complex, stylized, culturally specific ways, with attention to clothing and ornament and movement and ceremony, may have emerged in Australia as early as it emerged anywhere on Earth. And if that is true, it changes the story of the development of human artistic capacity in exactly the same way that the Mungo Lady burial changed the story of the development of human mortuary culture. It moves Australia from the periphery to the center. It suggests that this continent, which the rest of the world spent so long ignoring or dismissing or treating as a backwater, was actually one of the sites where the deepest expressions of human culture first took form. Let us go deeper. Let us talk about what is buried not just in the rock art and the sediments, but in the earth itself, in the deep geology of the continent. Because there is something in the ancient rocks of Australia that reaches back far beyond human history, far beyond the history of life on Earth as we know it, to questions about the nature of the planet itself and the conditions under which life first appeared. The Pilbara region of northwestern Australia, already familiar to us as the location of the Murujuga rock art, is also the location of some of the oldest exposed rock formations on the surface of the planet. The rocks of the Pilbara Craton, as geologists call it, are more than 3 billion years old. They formed when the Earth was barely a third of its current age, when the continents as we know them did not yet exist, when the planet's surface was a very different place. And within those ancient rocks, researchers have found something remarkable: fossilized microbial mats, stromatolites, the mineral records of ancient microbial communities that were building layered structures in shallow water more than 3 billion years ago. The stromatolites of the Pilbara are among the most significant fossils in the world, not because they are dramatic or visually striking, though the laminated columns of ancient mineral material have a spare, austere beauty of their own. They are significant because they are evidence. They are evidence that life was present on Earth more than 3 billion years ago, that it was already organized enough to build structures, that it was already modifying its environment through its metabolic activities. They are evidence that life on Earth is not a recent development, not a late addition to an otherwise sterile planet, but something that has been here in one form or another for the vast majority of the planet's existence. They are also evidence that is unique to Australia in its completeness and its age. Other ancient microbial fossils have been found in other parts of the world, but the Pilbara contains the most extensive, most diverse, and most clearly preserved examples, which is why, when astrobiologists, researchers who study the conditions under which life might exist beyond Earth, want to look at the oldest available examples of life in extreme environments, they come to Australia. They come to the Outback. They look at the ancient red rocks of the Pilbara and they ask what it can teach them about the conditions under which life can survive and flourish. The answer so far is both reassuring and unsettling. Life is more resilient, more adaptable, more willing to exploit unlikely environments than we had previously believed. The microbial communities of the ancient Pilbara existed in conditions that modern life would find hostile. High ultraviolet radiation because the ozone layer had not yet fully formed, low oxygen levels because photosynthesis was still in its early stages, high concentrations of minerals and chemicals that would be toxic to most modern organisms. And yet, life not only survived in these conditions, it thrived, it built structures. It left a record that we can read more than 3 billion years later. This tells us something important about the conditions under which life might exist elsewhere in the solar system and the universe. And it tells us something important about the history of life on Earth, about how long the experiment has been running, about how deep the roots go. The Australian Outback is not just a place where interesting things have been found, it is a place where the entire history of life on this planet is written in the rock. From the stromatolites of the Pilbara to the fossils of the ancient inland sea that once covered much of the continent to the bones of the megafauna that roamed the interior until relatively recently to the burial of Mungo Lady, and the engravings of Murujuga to the living traditions of the Aboriginal peoples who have been reading this landscape for 65,000 years. Every chapter of every story is there. The Earth itself is the archive. But let us return to the human story, because the most extraordinary discoveries in the Australian Outback are not the oldest ones. They are not the 3 billion-year-old stromatolites or the Cretaceous marine fossils, or even the Pleistocene megafauna bones. The most extraordinary discoveries are the ones that speak to who we are and how we became that way. The ones that force us to reconsider the story we have been telling about ourselves. And the most challenging of those discoveries is something that researchers have been grappling with for decades. Something that keeps turning up in the most unlikely places and in the most inconvenient forms. Evidence, or what looks very much like evidence, of connection, of contact, of relationship between the ancient peoples of Australia and the ancient peoples of other parts of the world, not in the colonial era, not in the age of sail, but earlier, much, much earlier. Let us start with the linguistic evidence, because it is both the most controversial and, in some ways, the most compelling. There are more than 250 distinct Aboriginal Australian languages, or there were before the catastrophic disruption of colonisation. Many of them are severely endangered or have been lost entirely in the past 2 centuries. But those that survive represent an extraordinary diversity of linguistic structure, of sounds and grammatical forms, and ways of organizing meaning that reflect tens of thousands of years of independent development. And yet, within this vast diversity, there are some structural features that appear widely across Australian languages that also appear in languages on the other side of the world, not as superficial similarities of vocabulary, which can always be dismissed as coincidence, but as deep structural features. Features of how sentences are organized, how verbs and nouns relate to each other, how time and causality and agency are encoded in language. Some linguists, working carefully within the boundaries of what the evidence actually supports, have suggested that these structural parallels point to very ancient connections, to a time when the ancestors of today's Aboriginal Australians were still in contact with populations that would eventually become the ancestors of peoples in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, in the ancient world more broadly. The structural features they share may be relics of a common linguistic ancestor, so ancient that all other traces of the connection have been erased by time and distance and divergence. This is contested. Linguistics is a field in which it is very easy to see patterns that are not there, to find resemblances that reflect the limited number of ways human languages can organize themselves rather than genuine historical connections. The mainstream position in historical linguistics is skeptical of connections as old and as distant as some researchers have proposed for Australian languages. But the structural parallels are there. They do not go away when you look at them carefully. And they sit alongside the genetic evidence and the archaeological evidence in a way that is at least suggestive, that hints at a story of human connection in deep time that we are only beginning to have the tools to investigate properly. Now, let us talk about something that is not contested, something that is accepted by the scientific community, and that is, in its own way, just as extraordinary as anything we have discussed so far. Let us talk about what the Aboriginal Australians knew about the sky that the rest of the world did not know for thousands of years. We have already touched on this, but it deserves its own consideration, because the depth of Aboriginal astronomical knowledge is genuinely staggering when you begin to examine it systematically. The Kamilaroi and Yuwalai peoples of New South Wales developed an astronomical tradition that included detailed tracking of the movements of stars and planets, prediction of weather, and seasonal changes based on astronomical observations, and the organization of ceremonial and social life around an astronomical calendar. This is not unusual in itself. Many ancient cultures around the world developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge. What is unusual is what specifically they observed and how accurately they recorded it. The dark constellations. The patterns form not by stars, but by the dark patches between them, the regions of the Milky Way where dust clouds block the light of the stars behind them. These dark constellations, known in the Kamilaroi and Yuwalai tradition by specific names and associated with specific stories, are not recognized in Western astronomical tradition. Western astronomy, derived from the ancient Middle Eastern and Greek traditions, organized the night sky around the bright points of light around the stars. The dark spaces were, in the Western tradition, nothing, background, emptiness. But the dark constellations of Aboriginal Australian astronomy are real features of the sky. They are the molecular clouds and dust lanes of the Milky Way, real structures with real physical significance. And the Aboriginal tradition had been mapping them, naming them, assigning them astronomical significance, encoding observations about their movements and their relationship to the seasons, for tens of thousands of years before any other astronomical tradition recognized that they existed. When Western astronomers in the 20th century began to study the structure of the Milky Way in detail, with radio telescopes and infrared detectors that could see through the dust, they discovered what Aboriginal Australian astronomical tradition had known for an enormous span of time. The dark regions of the Milky Way are not empty. They are among the most structurally complex and scientifically interesting parts of our galaxy. They are regions of star formation, of complex chemistry, of processes that are fundamental to the ongoing evolution of the galaxy itself. Aboriginal Australian astronomy had this right. For thousands of years before the instruments existed to confirm it in the Western scientific tradition, the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australia were encoding accurate information about the structure of the galaxy. This is not a minor thing. This is not a cute parallel or a coincidence. This is evidence that sustained, systematic, multi-generational observation of the natural world can produce knowledge of real scientific accuracy. That the methods of knowledge production used by indigenous cultures, the careful observation and the oral transmission and the embedding of data in story and ceremony, are not inferior substitutes for the written record and the institutional science of the Western tradition. They are different methods that are genuinely capable of producing and preserving genuine knowledge. And this has implications that extend far beyond the question of Australian astronomy. It has implications for how we think about what has been lost in the disruption and destruction of indigenous cultures around the world, about what knowledge was encoded in the traditions of peoples who were colonized and displaced, and whose cultural continuity was deliberately broken, about how much we do not know that we do not know. the Australian Outback, and the people who have been its custodians for 65,000 years, are a reminder that knowledge can take many forms, and that dismissing a form of knowledge because it does not look like what you are familiar with is a way of impoverishing yourself. Let us turn now to something that has generated enormous amounts of both serious research and less serious speculation, something that sits at the intersection of genuine scientific inquiry and the kind of claims that circulate in the stranger corners of the internet, something that requires careful handling because the genuine strangeness of the real evidence is dramatic enough without embellishment, and the embellishments that have been attached to it have, in some cases, made it harder to take the real evidence seriously. Let us talk about the claims of pre-Columbian contact between Australia and the Americas. The idea that there was contact between Australia and the American continents before the era of European exploration is, on its face, something that mainstream archaeology regards with great skepticism. The evidence for it is contested, and the mechanisms by which such contact could have occurred are not obvious. The distances involved are enormous. The Pacific Ocean between Australia and the western coast of South America is roughly 12,000 kilometers at its narrowest point. Crossing it without modern navigation technology would be a challenge of extraordinary difficulty, and yet there are some things in the archaeological and biological record that are genuinely difficult to explain without invoking some form of contact. The sweet potato is a plant domesticated in the Americas. Its wild relatives are American. Its genetics are American. There is no credible argument for it having evolved anywhere else. And yet, when the first Europeans arrived in Polynesia, they found sweet potatoes already growing there. The sweet potato had crossed the Pacific. Somehow, at some point well before European contact, it had made the journey from South America to Polynesia. The most widely accepted explanation is that Polynesian voyagers reached the Americas, encountered the sweet potato, and carried it back with them on their return voyage. The linguistic evidence supports this. The word for sweet potato in Polynesian languages is closely related to the word for it in the Quechua language of the Andes, and this relationship is old enough that it cannot be explained by post-European contact. So, we know that Polynesian voyagers reached the Americas. We know they traveled enormous distances across the Pacific. And we know that Australia has a long history of contact with Polynesian peoples through the Torres Strait and the northern coast. Does this prove that Australian peoples had contact with the Americas in the pre-Columbian era? No, it does not. The connection is indirect and the evidence is circumstantial, but it establishes that the Pacific Ocean was not the impenetrable barrier it is sometimes assumed to have been. People crossed it, plants crossed it, and the question of what else may have crossed it, and when, and who carried it, is one that the evidence has not yet fully answered. There are other biological anomalies. The presence in Australia of the dingo, a wild dog that appears in the archaeological record roughly 4,000 years ago, and has no known ancestor in the Australian continent's pre-human fauna. Dogs are domesticated from wolves, and there are no wolves native to Australia. The dingo arrived with people. Which people, and from where exactly, is still a matter of active research. But the dingo's arrival is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that Australia was not biologically isolated in the Holocene era. Things were coming in from outside. And then there is something even stranger. In some genetic analyses of ancient South American populations, researchers have found a signal, a faint genetic echo that appears to represent admixture from a population related to, though distinct from, the Aboriginal Australians. The signal is controversial. Some researchers believe it is real. Others believe it is an artifact of the analytical methods. It has not been definitively confirmed, but the papers that report it are peer-reviewed and published in serious scientific journals, and the researchers who identified it are credible and careful. If the signal is real, it means that at some point before the arrival of Europeans in the Americas, genetic material from a population ancestrally related to Aboriginal Australians was entering the gene pool of the indigenous peoples of South America. It means there was contact, real contact, people moving across the Pacific in both directions. The mechanism most often proposed for this contact is Polynesian voyaging, which is already known to have connected Polynesia with both Australia and the Americas. If Polynesian voyagers carried not just sweet potatoes but people on their trans-Pacific journeys, if they were conducting the kind of large-scale, organized exploration that their descendants in the historical era were clearly capable of, then the genetic signal in South America becomes explicable. But it is also possible that the story is older, that the ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians, those early navigators who crossed the sea to reach Australia 65,000 years ago, in what was already one of the most impressive maritime achievements in human history, continued to push the boundaries of what was possible, continued to explore, continued to follow the currents and the stars and the birds across the surface of a world that was vastly larger than any one people could comprehend. We do not know. The evidence is there. The signal is there. But the story it is trying to tell us is still partially obscured, still partially buried in the depths of time and the complexity of the human past, still waiting to be fully read. And this is the nature of what scientists have found buried in the Australian Outback. It is not a single discovery. It is not a neat package with clear implications and obvious conclusions. It is a collection of pieces of an enormous puzzle. Pieces that individually are extraordinary and that together, when you try to assemble them, suggest something even more extraordinary. A history of this continent and its people that is more ancient, more sophisticated, more connected to the rest of the human world, and more important to our understanding of our own species than we have traditionally recognized. The Outback has been hiding secrets, not because it is secretive, not because it has been trying to conceal anything, but because we were not looking, because we brought the wrong assumptions, the wrong frameworks, the wrong questions, because the people whose ancestors built the oldest continuous civilization on Earth were for a long time not treated as the bearers of knowledge that scientists should be seeking to understand. Because the evidence, when it appeared, often appeared in forms that did not fit the existing categories, and so was set aside rather than grappled with. We are grappling with it now. The grappling is slow and imperfect, and still marked by the legacies of the mistakes that were made before. But it is happening, and what it is revealing is nothing less than a fundamental revision of the human story. Let us talk about the fossils of the ancient megafauna, because they are another thread in this tapestry, another piece of the puzzle, and they raise questions that connect the human story in Australia to questions about the relationship between human beings and the natural world that are very much alive today. The Australian megafauna were extraordinary. In the Pleistocene era, the geological period that ended roughly 11,000 years ago, Australia was home to an array of large animals that make the current fauna look almost modest by comparison. There was Diprotodon optatum, a wombat-like creature the size of a rhinoceros that was the largest marsupial ever to live. There was Procoptodon goliath, a giant short-faced kangaroo that stood 2.5 meters tall. There was Megalania prisca, the giant monitor lizard we mentioned earlier, a predator that may have reached 7 meters in length and would have been the apex predator of the Australian landscape. There was Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, with a bite force proportionally greater than any modern carnivore. There was, in short, a world of large, spectacular animals that is now entirely gone. The question of what caused the extinction of the Australian megafauna is one of the most contentious debates in quaternary science. There are two main hypotheses, and they are not mutually exclusive. One is climate change. The transition from the glacial conditions of the late Pleistocene to the warmer, drier conditions of the Holocene caused dramatic changes in Australian ecosystems. The vegetation changed, the water sources changed. The landscape that the megafauna had evolved for was transformed into something different. The other hypothesis is humans. The ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians arrived on the continent somewhere between 50 and 65,000 years ago. The megafauna began to disappear shortly afterward. In the geological record, the timing of human arrival and the timing of megafaunal extinction are uncomfortably close together. The debate between these two hypotheses has been going on for decades, and it shows no signs of being definitively resolved. The evidence for climate change as a driver is real. The evidence for human impact is also real. The most nuanced current view holds that both factors were involved, that the megafauna were already under stress from changing conditions when humans arrived, and that the addition of human predation, and perhaps more importantly, human landscape modification through fire, pushed them over a threshold they would not otherwise have crossed. The reason this matters is not purely historical. The Australian megafauna extinction is one of the clearest examples in the prehistoric record of the interaction between human populations and large animal communities. It happened earlier than the megafauna extinctions in the Americas and Eurasia and Africa. It has been studied more intensively in some ways than those later events. And the lessons it contains about what happens when a new, highly capable predator is introduced into an ecosystem that has not evolved in the presence of such a predator. Those lessons are directly relevant continent to understanding the biodiversity crisis that is happening right now. The extinction of the Australian megafauna was not a crime. The people who hunted Diprotodon did not know they were doing something that would leave the continent without its largest animals for the rest of geological time. They were doing what human beings do. They were using the resources available to them with the tools and the knowledge they had. But the consequences of what they did are still written in the landscape, in the absence of the large grazers and browsers and predators that once structured the ecology of the continent, in the ways that the vegetation and the soil and the water have been shaped by their absence. And it raises a question that the Aboriginal Australians themselves grapple with in their traditions, in the responsibilities encoded in the custodianship of country that is central to many Indigenous Australian cultures. What does it mean to be responsible for a place? What does it mean to take care of the living world you inhabit? What obligations do you have to the other species you share the landscape with? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are questions with practical consequences. And the Australian Outback, with its deep record of the relationship between human beings and the natural world, is one of the places on Earth where those questions have been asked and answered imperfectly and in various ways for the longest period of time. The Aboriginal concept of country is not the same as the Western concept of land. Country is not territory to be owned and exploited. It is a living entity with which human beings have a relationship of mutual obligation. Country requires care. Country remembers. Country has needs. And the people who belong to a particular country have responsibilities toward it that are encoded in their law and ceremony and story, and that have been transmitted across generations for tens of thousands of years. This concept, which might seem like an abstract cultural philosophy to someone coming from a tradition in which land is primarily an economic resource, has practical implications for the management of the landscape that are only now being fully recognized by conservation science. The fire management practices of the Aboriginal Australians, the controlled burning of country according to a detailed understanding of seasonal conditions and ecological relationships, maintained the Australian landscape for tens of thousands of years in a state of remarkable biodiversity and productivity. When colonization disrupted these practices, when the people who had been managing the land were displaced and their burning practices were prohibited or abandoned, the landscape changed. The fuel load in the vegetation increased. The fires that eventually came were no longer the mosaic of small, controlled burns that maintained ecological diversity. They were the catastrophic megafires that have become a feature of the Australian summer in recent decades. The recognition that returning to Indigenous fire management practices could help address the fire crisis in Australia is itself a kind of scientific discovery. A discovery that the knowledge encoded in the oldest continuing culture on Earth has practical, urgent, contemporary relevance. That the archive preserved in the Outback is not just a historical curiosity, but a living resource. Let us now turn to one of the most enigmatic aspects of the Australian Outback, something that exists at the intersection of geology, ecology, human history, and something that is harder to categorize. Something that many researchers approach cautiously, not because they doubt its reality, but because its implications are so large and so strange. Let us talk about the sacred sites. Across the Australian Outback, there are places that the Aboriginal peoples have identified as sacred for as long as their oral traditions extend. Places of spiritual power and significance. Places where ceremonies are conducted and where the relationships between human beings and the land and the spirit world are enacted and renewed. Places that are mapped in the complex ceremonial geography of the dreaming tracks that cross and recross the continent. Uluru is the most famous of these places. The great sandstone monolith rising nearly 400 meters from the plain of the Central Australian desert is recognized internationally as a place of extraordinary power and beauty, a World Heritage Site, one of the most visited natural wonders on Earth. But for the Anangu people, whose traditional country includes Uluru and the surrounding landscape, the rock is not primarily a natural wonder. It is a living spiritual presence. It is a place where the ancestral beings of the dreaming created the landscape and where the relationships between species and between human beings and country are encoded in the physical features of the stone. The dreaming. This is perhaps the most misunderstood concept in Australian cultural life. It is not a historical period in the simple sense. It is not a mythology in the dismissive sense. The dreaming, or what is called in different Aboriginal languages by terms that translate variously as the law, the eternal, the all at once, is a way of understanding time and place and relationship that is fundamentally different from the linear, historical understanding that dominates Western culture. In the dreaming, the ancestral beings who shaped the landscape are not historical figures who existed in the distant past and then ceased to exist. They are present. They are part of the living landscape. Their activities at the time of creation are still happening, in some sense, in the same locations where they always happened. The sacred sites are not monuments to something that is over. They are places where the eternal creative activity of the ancestral beings can still be encountered if you know how to encounter it. This is a framework for understanding the world that cannot be easily translated into Western philosophical terms. It is not simply a different religion, in the sense that Buddhism and Christianity are different religions, sharing many of the same underlying assumptions about the nature of reality, and differing primarily in their specific beliefs and practices. It is a fundamentally different way of understanding the relationship between time and place and living beings and the sacred, and it is encoded in ways that researchers are only beginning to understand in the landscape itself. The sacred sites of the Australian Outback are not randomly distributed. They are connected to each other by dreaming tracks, routes followed by the ancestral beings as they moved across the landscape, creating the features of the world. These tracks cross the continent in complex patterns, connecting sacred sites across enormous distances, maintaining a spiritual geography that overlays and intersects with the physical geography. Some researchers have noted that many of the sacred sites identified in Aboriginal tradition correspond to geological features of real significance, particularly productive water sources, areas of unusual mineralogy, places where the geological record is especially rich or where the physical environment has unusual properties. The sacred geography of the dreaming tracks may in some cases be encoding practical ecological knowledge in spiritual form, marking the most important features of the landscape in a way that ensures they are remembered and respected across generations. This is not to reduce the sacred to the merely practical. The dreaming is not simply a coded survival manual dressed up in spiritual language, but the observation that the sacred sites of Aboriginal Australian tradition often correspond to places of real ecological significance is not coincidental. It reflects the depth and the sophistication of the knowledge encoded in the tradition. The spiritual and the practical are not separate in this framework. The obligations to care for country that are encoded in the dreaming are obligations that have maintained the ecological health of this landscape for tens of thousands of years. The Australian Outback holds all of this. The 3 billion-year-old stromatolites, the bones of the ancient megafauna, the ochre-stained burial of Mungo Lady, the engravings of Murujuga, the Bradshaw paintings of the Kimberley, the astronomical traditions of the Kamilaroi and the Yolngu and the Burong, the flood memories of the coastal peoples, the genetic archive of the oldest surviving human genetic lineage on the planet, the sacred geography of the dreaming, the fire management knowledge that maintained a continent for 65,000 years. It holds all of this, and it holds more. More than we have yet found, more than we have yet understood, more than we have yet been willing to see, because the history of the encounter between Western science and the knowledge of the Australian Outback is not a simple story of discovery. It is a story of discovery and dismissal and reluctant rediscovery, of things being found and then set aside because they did not fit the existing frameworks, of knowledge being present for thousands of years but not recognized as knowledge because it was encoded in forms that the people who arrived from outside did not have the cultural equipment to recognize. We are, slowly and imperfectly, getting better at this. The collaboration between Western science and Aboriginal knowledge holders is producing results that neither tradition could produce alone. The fire management programs that are bringing Indigenous burning practices back to the landscape are reducing fire risk in ways that conventional fire management has not been able to match. The astronomical knowledge of the Aboriginal Australians is informing research into the history of the night sky and the structure of the galaxy. The oral traditions that preserve memories of ancient coastlines are providing data to geologists and oceanographers studying sea level change. The genetic archive of Aboriginal Australian populations is helping researchers reconstruct the earliest chapters of human migration out of Africa. And there is more to come. The stories are still being told. The knowledge is still present. The archive is still there. What has changed is not the archive, but our willingness to look at it properly. What scientists have found buried in the Australian Outback is not simply a set of remarkable archaeological discoveries or surprising geological formations or interesting biological data. What they have found is a challenge to the stories we tell about ourselves, about when we became the kind of beings we are, about where the oldest and deepest expressions of human culture first took form, about how knowledge is created and preserved and transmitted across deep time. The Outback does not offer easy answers, it offers evidence. And the evidence, considered carefully and honestly, suggests that the standard story is incomplete, that there are chapters in the human narrative that have been missing, that the oldest, deepest, most fundamental chapters of that narrative are written not in the ruins of ancient cities in the Middle East, or the libraries of ancient Greece, or the monuments of imperial China, but in the red earth of a continent that the rest of the world spent centuries ignoring. The story of what scientists found buried in the Australian outback is still being told. New discoveries are still being made, new layers of the archive are still being opened, and with each new discovery, the picture becomes at once clearer and more complex, more detailed and more vast. Let us keep going, because we have barely scratched the surface. There is a valley in South Australia, in the Flinders Ranges, where the hills are purple and ochre in the afternoon light, and the sky above them is the kind of blue that makes you feel the distance between yourself and the edge of the atmosphere. This valley is called Parachilna, and nearby, in the ancient seabed sediments that form the walls of those hills, there are fossils. Not the fossils of large dramatic animals, not the bones of dinosaurs or the shells of ammonites or the teeth of ancient sharks. These are much older and much stranger. They are the fossils of organisms that lived here when this valley, this beautiful purple ochre valley beneath the blue Australian sky, was at the bottom of a shallow sea. And those organisms lived more than 540 million years ago. The Ediacaran fauna of the Flinders Ranges, named for the Ediacaran Hills where they were first formally described in the 1940s, though Aboriginal people had known about them for far longer. These fossils represent something unique in the history of life on Earth. They are the remains of the first complex multicellular animals, the first organisms to grow large enough to be visible to the naked eye, the first life forms to develop the differentiated body plans, the specialized tissues, the organized structures that would eventually give rise to every animal that has ever walked or swum or flown or burrowed. They are the dawn of animal life, and they are buried in the hills of the Australian outback. For a long time after their discovery, the Ediacaran organisms were difficult to classify. They did not look like any modern animal group. They were often described as quilted or mattress-like, flat frond-shaped creatures that lay on the seafloor and appear to have absorbed nutrients directly from the water around them. They had no heads, no appendages, no obvious digestive systems. They were so unlike modern animals that some researchers propose they represented an entirely extinct experiment in multicellular life, a false start that was completely unrelated to any modern animal group. More recent research has complicated and enriched this picture. Some Ediacaran organisms do appear to be related to modern animal groups. Others may indeed represent evolutionary lineages that did not survive into the Cambrian period. The full picture of what the Ediacaran fauna actually was, what its relationship to modern life is, what it tells us about the conditions under which animal life first evolved, is still being worked out. But the fact that the best preserved and most diverse assemblage of Ediacaran organisms in the world is found in Australia is not coincidental. It reflects the geological stability of the Australian continent, the way that the ancient rocks here have been preserved with a completeness that is rare elsewhere. The Australian craton, the ancient core of the continent, has not been subjected to the intense tectonic activity that has destroyed or transformed ancient rock formations in other parts of the world. The deep geological record here is intact in a way that it is not elsewhere, and the record it contains, from the Ediacaran fauna to the Pilbara stromatolites to the geological formations of the outback's vast interior, is unlike anything found anywhere else on Earth. Australia is not just a place where important things have been found. It is a place that preserves things. The geology preserves ancient life. The deep aquifers preserve ancient water and ancient microbes. The rock surfaces preserve ancient art. The oral traditions preserve ancient knowledge. The genomes of the people who have lived here preserve ancient genetic lineages. The entire continent functions as an archive of extraordinary depth and completeness. And the archive is still yielding new information. In 2016, a team of researchers studying the geology of a remote part of the Western Australian outback found something in the ancient rock that stopped them in their tracks. In formations that had been mapped and analysed many times before, in the deep Archean sediments of the Pilbara, they found structures. Structures in the rock that were consistent with, though not definitively proof of, microbial life. But not microbial life at the age they expected. Not 3 billion years old, older. The age of the structures they found was 3.48 billion years, and the significance of that number goes beyond the immediate strangeness of something that old. At 348 billion years, these structures would be among the very oldest evidence of life ever found on Earth. They would push the record of life's presence on this planet back to within 1 billion years of the planet's formation. They would suggest that life appeared on Earth very quickly, in geological terms, after the planet cooled enough to support it. And that implication echoes outward. If life appeared so quickly after the Earth formed, then the conditions for life may not be as rare as some models of astrobiology have assumed. If life can appear within the first 1 billion years of a rocky planet's existence, given the right conditions, then the universe may be teeming with it in ways we have not yet found evidence for, but that the evidence from the Australian Outback makes seem more plausible. The Outback is reaching into the deepest questions, the questions about the origins of life, about the conditions under which it appears and diversifies, about whether we are alone in the universe. The red rocks of the Pilbara are not just Australian rocks. They are a message about the nature of the universe itself, encoded in mineral and time. Now, let us bring the story forward again. Let us talk about some of the discoveries that are less ancient, but no less extraordinary. Discoveries that relate not to the deep geological or biological past, but to the more recent human past, to the thousands of years before European contact, when the Aboriginal peoples of Australia were living in ways that the European world had no framework to understand or appreciate. The question of what Australian Aboriginal society was like before contact is one that has been distorted by the assumptions of colonial anthropology. The image that was constructed in the 19th and early 20th centuries of small, scattered groups of nomadic hunter-gatherers living at the absolute margins of subsistence, moving constantly and leaving almost nothing behind, was not just incomplete, it was wrong in fundamental ways. And the evidence that it was wrong has been accumulating for decades, building toward a picture that is radically different from the colonial caricature. Let us start with population. How many people were living in Australia before European contact in 1788? For a very long time, the standard estimate was somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million. This estimate was in part based on the conditions the first Europeans observed, which were conditions that had already been dramatically altered by the wave of disease that preceded direct colonial contact, and that killed an enormous proportion of the Aboriginal population before the first settlers ever arrived in many parts of the continent. More recent estimates, based on a more sophisticated understanding of Aboriginal land management practices and carrying capacity, of historical accounts from early contact, and of the population dynamics that would have been necessary to maintain the cultural complexity and geographic spread of Aboriginal society, have pushed the numbers significantly higher. Some researchers now estimate that the pre-contact population of Australia may have been as high as 3 to 5 million people. Others go higher still. If these estimates are correct, and the evidence for them is growing, then the Australia that the British settlers arrived in was not an empty continent inhabited by a sparse marginal population. It was a densely inhabited land, supporting millions of people, organized into complex social and political systems, with established trade networks and ceremonial institutions and systems of land management that had been operating successfully for tens of thousands of years. And it was a land that had been fundamentally shaped by its inhabitants. The concept of terra nullius, the legal fiction that Australia was empty land belonging to no one when the British arrived, was not just morally wrong, it was empirically wrong. The land was not empty, it was not unmanaged, it was not unmodified. It was the product of tens of thousands of years of human care and management, a landscape that had been shaped by its inhabitants as surely as the farmlands of England or the gardens of France had been shaped by theirs. Just in different ways, using different methods, producing a different result. The fire management practices of the Aboriginal peoples, the mosaic burning of country that maintained the landscape in a state of high biodiversity and high productivity, were not random or casual. They were sophisticated, targeted, knowledge-intensive interventions in the ecology of the continent. They required detailed understanding of the vegetation and the soils and the seasonal patterns and the movement of animals. They required coordination across communities and across territories. They produced results that can still be read in the landscape, in the structure of the vegetation in areas where traditional burning has been maintained, in the health of the bird and mammal communities in those areas, in the reduced fire risk and the increased diversity of plant species. The eel traps of the Gunditjmara people in Western Victoria are another example. These are stone structures built in the waterways of the Hopkins River system and the Lake Condah area, designed to trap and harvest eels as they move through the landscape seasonally. The structures are not simple. They are complex engineered systems that required knowledge of hydrology and eel behavior and stone construction techniques. They were built to manage eel populations over the long term, not just to harvest them, but to maintain the populations at levels that would continue to be productive into the future. These structures are ancient. Some of them appear to date back more than 6,000 years, making them among the oldest known examples of systematic aquaculture anywhere in the world. And they supported a population density in this part of Western Victoria that is only possible if you have a reliable managed food source. The people who built and maintained these eel traps were not nomadic hunter-gatherers in the way that term is typically understood. They were sedentary or semi-sedentary aquaculturalists. They built permanent stone houses, they maintained complex social and ceremonial institutions. They had a way of life that was sophisticated and productive and sustainable, and that looked in many functional ways more like early village farming societies than like the nomadic groups that colonial ideology insisted that all Aboriginal Australians had to be. The Budj-Bim cultural landscape, the area around Lake Condah where the Gonditjmara eel traps are located, was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2019. Not because of its natural beauty, though it has that, but because of the extraordinary cultural heritage it represents. Because of the evidence it contains of a sophisticated, ancient, and sustained tradition of aquaculture and landscape management that is unique in the world and that challenges fundamental assumptions about the capacities of non-agricultural societies. But the eel traps are not the only unexpected evidence of Aboriginal engineering and economic sophistication. In Queensland, in the Channel Country of the Far West, where rivers braid across enormous floodplains and the land floods seasonally, there are stone fish traps that cover areas of several hectares that are built with a precision and a scale that required significant labor and significant planning, that were clearly designed not for individual or casual use, but for the systematic harvest of fish across entire river systems. These structures, too, are ancient. Some of them appear to have been in continuous use for thousands of years. In the inland desert regions, there are networks of wells and water sources, many of them maintained and modified over long periods of time, that made it possible to traverse landscapes that would otherwise be impassable. The knowledge of where water could be found, of how to maintain and improve natural water sources, of how to travel across the desert following a network of reliable water points, was itself a form of infrastructure. A water infrastructure that was as essential to the people who depended on it as roads or aqueducts were to other ancient civilizations. And in multiple parts of the continent, there are grinding stones, mortars and pestles used to process plant foods, particularly seeds, into flour. The presence of these tools and the habitual use sites where they are concentrated demonstrates something important about how Aboriginal people were using their landscape. They were not simply gathering and eating whatever they happened to find. They were systematically processing plant foods in ways that required equipment, technique, and knowledge. Some researchers have argued that the intensive processing of grass seeds in parts of Australia represents a form of incipient agriculture, a system of land use that was moving toward, but had not yet crossed, the threshold into what we usually call farming. Why it did not cross that threshold, why Australia did not develop agriculture in the way that other parts of the world did, is a question with a complex answer. Part of the answer is ecological. The Australian environment does not contain the same concentration of easily domesticable plant and animal species that exists in the Fertile Crescent or in the Yellow River Valley or in the high-altitude plains of the Andes. The grasses of Australia are harder to cultivate than wheat and barley. The animals are harder to domesticate than sheep and cattle. The advantages of farming over intensive gathering were smaller, and the costs were larger. But part of the answer may also be cultural. The decision not to farm in a context where the intensive management of natural resources was already providing reliable, abundant food may have been a conscious choice. A choice not to trade the flexibility and diversity of a managed wild food system for the stability, but also the vulnerability of dependence on a small number of cultivated species. In retrospect, given what we now know about the ecological consequences of agriculture, this may have been a wise choice. The Aboriginal relationship with the Australian landscape was more sustainable over deep time than the agricultural relationship with any other landscape in the world. Let us now talk about something that is even more hidden, something that has been the subject of both careful scientific investigation and a great deal of speculation and mythology. Something that sits at the very edge of what the evidence currently supports and where it begins to shade into territory that requires more cautious handling. Let us talk about the claims of ancient contact between Australia and the ancient civilizations of the Middle East and South Asia. The claims come in various forms. Some of them are based on apparent similarities between Aboriginal Australian traditions and the traditions of ancient civilizations elsewhere. Some of them are based on objects that have been found in Australia that appear not to belong there. Some of them are based on inscriptions or markings that some researchers have interpreted as being in ancient scripts from outside Australia. Most of these claims do not survive careful scrutiny. The apparent similarities between Aboriginal traditions and ancient Middle Eastern or South Asian traditions are, in most cases, the kinds of superficial parallels that can be found between any two human cultures, because human beings everywhere share certain fundamental preoccupations and certain fundamental ways of organizing experience. The objects that have been claimed as evidence of ancient contact are, in most cases, either misidentified or the product of more recent historical processes. The inscriptions that have been claimed as ancient scripts are, in most cases, not inscriptions at all but natural markings, or are the products of relatively recent Aboriginal art traditions that have been misread by people unfamiliar with those traditions. And this is important, the fact that many specific claims of ancient contact do not hold up does not mean that the question of ancient contact can be dismissed. The genetic evidence of South Asian admixture in Aboriginal Australian populations around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago is real. The presence of the dingo, which arrived in Australia around the same time as a domesticated species, is real. The new tool traditions that appear in the archaeological record in the same period are real. Something was happening. There was contact. The question is not whether contact occurred, but when and through what mechanism and with what consequences. The Macassan Trepangas. This is one of the clearest and best documented examples of pre-European foreign contact with Australia. For centuries before the arrival of the British, fishermen from the Macassan port city of Makassar, in what is now the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, were making annual voyages to the northern coast of Australia to harvest trepang, the sea cucumber that was highly valued as a food product in China. These voyages continued for a very long time, probably several centuries, before they were disrupted by the imposition of colonial regulations in the late 19th century. The Macassan contact left real traces in Australian Aboriginal culture. Words from the Macassan language entered the vocabulary of Aboriginal groups in northern Australia. Dugout canoes, a technology not indigenous to Australia, were adopted by coastal groups in the Northern Territory through Macassan influence. Practices and material culture elements that can be traced to Macassan origin are present in the traditions of Aboriginal peoples along the coast they visited. This is ancient contact that we can document clearly. It happened, it left traces, it changed things. And it raises the question of whether it was unique or whether it was one episode in a much longer history of contact between Australia and the outside world that we have not yet been able to document as clearly. The Macassans were trading on the foundation of established maritime trade networks that extended from East Africa to Japan. They were part of a world of long-distance maritime commerce that had been operating for millennia. The routes they used to reach Australia were not invented in the era of the trepang trade. They were established routes following known currents and monsoon patterns that had been used by maritime traders for a very long time. Who else might have used those routes? What other contacts might have occurred along those same sea lanes in earlier periods, leaving traces that are fainter and harder to read than the clear record of Macassan contact, but that are nonetheless there in the genetic and archaeological and cultural record? The evidence does not yet give us a clear answer, but the question is legitimate and the investigation is ongoing. Let us talk about water. Not the ancient water of the Great Artesian Basin, not the subterranean lakes and the fossil microbes, but water as it was understood and managed and celebrated by the people who have lived in this landscape for 65,000 years. Water in the Australian Outback is not simply a physical resource. It is not simply a liquid that falls from the sky and collects in low places and is necessary for survival. Water, in the framework of many Aboriginal Australian cultures, is alive. It has its own relationships, its own obligations, its own stories. Certain water sources are sacred. Certain water holes are the homes of powerful beings, of the bunyip or the water horse or the rainbow serpent. Certain water must be approached with care, with ceremony, with the right knowledge and the right relationship. The rainbow serpent is perhaps the most widely shared narrative being in Australian Aboriginal tradition. Found in various forms across the continent, in different language groups and different cultural traditions, the rainbow serpent is associated with water, with the waterways that traverse the landscape, with the creative power that shaped the landforms through which water moves. The serpent is not simply a character in a story. story. The serpent is present in the landscape, in the way the waterways curve and cut through the earth, in the way water moves and pools and disappears and reappears. This is a way of understanding the relationship between water and landscape that is, in some of its details, remarkably consistent with what hydrogeology now tells us about how water actually moves through the Australian landscape. The underground pathways that water follows, the springs and soakages and clay pans where underground water surfaces. The way that the movement of water through the landscape has shaped its features over geological time, these are things that the rainbow serpent traditions encode in symbolic form. Not identically, not as a literal description of hydrogeology, but in ways that reflect a deep and accurate understanding of the landscape's water system, an understanding that was necessary for survival and that was encoded in cultural form to ensure its transmission across generations. The outback is full of places where the surface appearance of arid, waterless land conceals the presence of water beneath, where what looks from the surface like a dead, dry, inhospitable landscape is actually sitting above a complex water system. The people who have lived here longest know these places. They are mapped in the dreaming tracks and the sacred sites and the oral traditions. They are held in cultural memory in ways that have sustained human life in apparently impossible environments for thousands of years. When the first European explorers entered the Australian interior, many of them died of thirst in landscapes where Aboriginal people had been living for tens of thousands of years. This was not because the water was not there. It was because the Europeans did not know how to find it, did not have the knowledge of the landscape that would have allowed them to survive in it. The knowledge was there, held by the Aboriginal people of those areas, but for various reasons, a combination of cultural barriers and colonial attitudes, and sometimes simple bad luck, it was not shared in time to save the explorers. Burke and Wills, the most famous victims of this failure of knowledge transfer, died within walking distance of a group of Aboriginal people who were surviving perfectly comfortably on the resources available in the landscape. The tragedy of their death is not simply a story of exploration gone wrong. It is a story about the catastrophic consequences of refusing to learn from people who know something you do not know. The Australian Outback contains, in the oral traditions of the people who have lived in it for 65,000 years, an enormous amount of knowledge about water, about plants, about animals, about weather, about the movements of the sun and moon and stars, about how to maintain a landscape so that it continues to support life, about how to live in some of the most apparently inhospitable environments on Earth. This knowledge has been the subject of intense interest in recent decades, as researchers in ecology and conservation and water management and fire management have begun to understand its practical value. But the recognition is still partial and still imperfect. The knowledge is still held primarily by elders whose numbers are declining in communities that are dealing with the consequences of 2 centuries of disruption and displacement. The window for understanding and recording and making proper use of this knowledge is not unlimited. The archive is still open, but it is not open forever. Let us step back from the specific details and look at the larger picture. The picture that emerges from all of this evidence, from the genetics and the archaeology and the geology and the astronomy and the oral traditions and the ecological record. The picture of what Australia is and what its history means for our understanding of the human story. Australia is the oldest laboratory on Earth. It is the place where the experiment of multicellular life was running earliest, where the experiment of complex animal life left its first clear record, where the experiment of human cultural sophistication was underway before it was underway anywhere else we can identify with confidence, where the experiment of human adaptation to an extreme environment has been running longer than anywhere else. And it is a laboratory that has been closed to the wider world for most of that history. Not completely closed, not sealed, but the currents of human connection that ran between Australia and the rest of the world were thin and intermittent compared to the dense networks of exchange that connected the continents of the Northern Hemisphere to each other. Australia was, in a sense, running its own independent trial of the human experiment. And the results of that trial, now that we are beginning to be able to read them, are telling us things about the human experiment in general that we could not have learned any other way. They are telling us that human beings become fully modern, in the cultural and cognitive sense, earlier than we thought. They are telling us that the knowledge systems that indigenous cultures develop through long interaction with their environments are more sophisticated, and more accurate and more practically valuable than the Western tradition has historically acknowledged. They are telling us that the relationship between human beings and the land is not inherently extractive and destructive, but can be mutually sustaining, given the right frameworks and the right time. They are telling us that the stories people tell about themselves and their place in the world can preserve accurate information across timescales that dwarf the entire span of recorded history. They are telling us that genetic diversity, accumulated through tens of thousands of years of relatively isolated development, is a resource of incalculable value. They are telling us that the Earth's deep history is not a closed book, but an open archive, and that reading it requires methods and partnerships that science is only beginning to develop. The Australian Outback has shocked the world not because it contains something alien or impossible. It has shocked the world because it contains something human, something so deeply, so thoroughly, so comprehensively human that it forces us to revise our understanding of what humanity is and what it is capable of and how long it has been capable of it. The shock is not surprise at finding something strange. The shock is recognition. It is the moment when you look at something from the deep past and realize that you're looking at yourself. That is what scientists have found buried in the Australian outback. Let us go deeper still. There is a question that has been sitting at the edge of this entire conversation, surfacing occasionally and then retreating, waiting for the right moment to be addressed directly. It is not an Australian question, or rather, it is an Australian question that is also a question about the Americas, about the whole Pacific world, about what the deepest and most ancient chapters of the human story actually looked like when those chapters were being written. The question is this: what if the story of the Americas, of who was there first and how long they had been there and where they came from, is as incomplete as the story of Australia turned out to be? This is forbidden history in the truest sense. Not forbidden because it is occult or conspiratorial. Forbidden because it challenges the frameworks of the established scholarship so directly, so fundamentally, that the people who hold those frameworks have in many cases been reluctant to engage with the evidence that supports it. Not because the evidence is bad, because the implications are too large. Let us start with what is not contested. The first Americans arrived in the Western Hemisphere before the end of the last ice age. They came across the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia, or along the Pacific coast by boat from East Asia, or perhaps both, at different times and through different routes. This is accepted. This is consensus. The question that is contested is when. For most of the 20th century, the answer to when was approximately 13,000 years ago. This was the date associated with the Clovis culture, the first clearly identified archaeological tradition in North America. The Clovis people made a distinctive type of fluted stone spear point that has been found at sites across North America and even into South America. And for decades, the Clovis first theory held sway. The idea was that the Clovis people were the first Americans, that nothing came before them. The evidence against Clovis first began accumulating slowly, then rapidly, then in a flood that the defenders of the old model could no longer contain. Sites that appeared to predate Clovis began to be found. In Virginia, at Cactus Hill, there were artifacts below the Clovis layer, in sediments that dated to 15,000 years ago. In Pennsylvania, at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, the dates went back even further. 16,000 years, 19,000 years. The excavators of Meadowcroft were careful, their methods were rigorous, and their dates were contested for decades by Clovis supporters who found ways to cast doubt on them. But the sites kept multiplying, and then Monteverde happened. Monteverde is a site in southern Chile. Southern Chile, the very tip of South America, 13,000 kilometers from the Bering Land Bridge. And the dates at Monteverde, the dates that Tom Dillahay and his colleagues established through decades of careful excavation and analysis, those dates push back to at least 14,500 years ago, possibly older. If people were at the southern tip of South America 14,500 years ago, they had to have entered the Americas before that, significantly before that, because it takes time to travel 13,000 kilometers, even for a highly mobile population following a rich coastal environment. The best estimates, based on reasonable assumptions about population movement and ecological carrying capacity, suggest that the Americas would need to have been entered at least 16 to 20,000 years ago to produce the situation at Monteverde. And then the evidence started pushing back even further. At Chiquihuite Cave in Mexico, evidence of human presence dating to between 26,000 and 33,000 years ago, was published in 2020. The findings are contested, as findings this far outside the established timeline tend to be. But the excavators are credible, the methods are sound, and the dates are what the dates are. At Pedra Ferrada in Brazil, the dates that researcher Nida Guidon and her colleagues have proposed are even more startling. Over 100,000 years, not 30,000, not 50,000, 100,000 years. These claims are deeply controversial. Many researchers reject them. But Guidon and her colleagues have been working at this site for decades, and they stand by their evidence. Even if we set aside the most extreme claims, even if we accept only the sites that have achieved something approaching consensus acceptance, even if we say that the Americas were first entered somewhere between 20 and 30,000 years ago, that is still enormously significant. It means that there were people in the Americas during the last glacial maximum, during the time of maximum ice, during the period when the conventional model said the continent was effectively inaccessible. How did they get there? The Bering Land Bridge that would later allow passage was not accessible during the last glacial maximum. The coastal route following the Pacific coast was largely buried under ice. The interior route through Canada was blocked by the Laurentide ice sheet. The conventional models of entry do not work well for dates of 20 to 30,000 years ago, unless the entry route was different from the ones we have been focusing on. Unless people came by sea, not following the coast of East Asia, but crossing open ocean. Unless the people who first reached the Americas were not coming from Northeast Asia at all, but from somewhere further south, from a maritime tradition that was already capable of the kind of long-distance oceanic navigation that we know Polynesian peoples were later capable of. Unless, in other words, the first Americans came partly from the Pacific world, from populations connected, however distantly, to the ancient maritime expansions that carried the ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians to their continent 65,000 years ago. This is where the genetic signal we mentioned earlier becomes critically important. The signal in ancient South American genomes that appears to be related to Aboriginal Australians or to populations ancestrally connected to them. If that signal is real, if it represents actual admixture rather than an artifact of analysis, then it is saying something extraordinary. It is saying that there was a Pacific maritime connection between the Australian world and the South American world that predates European contact by thousands of years. It is saying that the first Americans were not all from the same place or the same time or the same route, that the peopling of the Americas was a complex multi-wave process that drew from multiple source populations from multiple directions over an extended period of time. It is saying that the Stone Age sailors who crossed the sea to Australia 65,000 years ago were part of a tradition of maritime expansion that was ongoing, that did not stop when they reached Australia, that continued to push further and further across the face of the water world. This is a story that does not fit neatly into any of the existing frameworks. It does not fit the Clovis first model that dominated American archaeology for most of the 20th century. It does not fit the simple, clean narrative of a single entry event through a single entry point at a single point in time. It does not fit the story that we have been telling about the peopling of the Americas, but it fits the evidence, imperfectly, incompletely, with gaps and uncertainties and debates that have not been resolved. But it fits. The first Americans may have been extraordinary seafarers whose maritime tradition connected the entire Pacific world, who were expanding into new territories across the ocean at the same time that other populations were expanding across the land bridges of the north. The Australian Outback is not just a record of Australian history. It may be a record of the beginning of the American story as well. Let us stay with the Americas for a while longer, because there are things buried there too, things that the conventional narratives have struggled to accommodate, that connect to what we have been discussing. The oldest confirmed human archaeological site in the Americas, as of the current state of the evidence, is not a Clovis site. It is not in Alaska or the Yukon. It is at White Sands National Park in New Mexico, where fossilized human footprints were found preserved in ancient lakebed sediments in 2021. The footprints were dated using a combination of radiocarbon dating of aquatic plant seeds found in the sediment layers and optically stimulated luminescence dating of the sediment itself. The age that emerged from the analysis was 21,000 years ago, at the height of the last glacial maximum. 21,000 years ago, when the ice sheets were at their maximum extent, when the Bering Corridor was blocked, when the conventional model said nobody could be in New Mexico. And yet, somebody was. Somebody walked across a mudflat beside an ancient lake in what is now New Mexico 21,000 years ago and left their footprints. and the footprints were preserved. And 21,000 years later, a team of scientists found them and read them and published the results in the journal Science. The implications are significant. They mean that the Americas were inhabited during the last glacial maximum. They mean that the people who made those footprints arrived in North America before the last glacial maximum, which in turn means they arrived before the time when the Beringian route was most accessible. They came another way, or they came earlier than we thought, when the route was still open, or both. The evidence at White Sands alone is consistent with multiple scenarios. But combined with the genetic evidence and the South American site evidence and the growing recognition that maritime technology was available much earlier than previously believed, it is contributing to a picture that is much more complex and much more ancient than the story that was told for most of the 20th century. The forbidden history of the Americas is not the history of aliens or lost continents or occult conspiracies, though those narratives have colonized the public imagination in ways that make it harder to take the genuine mystery seriously. The forbidden history is simply the history that the evidence is pointing toward, but that the conventional frameworks have been slow to accept. A history in which the Americas were entered earlier by more diverse populations, through more varied routes than we have traditionally acknowledged. A history in which the relationship between the Old World and the New World, before the era of European contact, was more complex and more extensive than we have been willing to believe. And a history in which Australia, the Outback, the people who have been there for 65,000 years, the genetic lineages preserved in their cells, and the knowledge preserved in their traditions, may be a key to understanding not just Australian history, but American history as well. There is something deeply satisfying about this idea. Not because it resolves the mysteries, it does not, it multiplies them, but because it suggests a world that is more connected, more complex, more full of human ingenuity and adventure than the simple narratives allow. It suggests that the Pacific Ocean was not a barrier, but a highway. That human beings, given sufficient time and sufficient motivation, can cross any distance and adapt to any environment and leave their mark on any landscape. The Australian Outback is a record of human tenacity and human knowledge and human creativity, stretched across 65,000 years of continuous inhabitation of one of the harshest environments on Earth. What the scientists who have studied it have found is not just data, it is evidence of what human beings are capable of when they have enough time and enough commitment and enough relationship with the place they inhabit. And the story it tells about the Americas, about the possibility of ancient connection, about the complexity of the human dispersal across the Pacific world, is a story that is still being investigated, still being tested, still generating both the careful scientific work and the passionate debate that all genuinely important questions generate. The Outback is not done yielding its secrets. Let us talk now about one more strand of this story, one that is less about the distant past and more about the recent past, about what happened when two worlds that had been developing separately for tens of thousands of years finally came into contact, and what was lost in that contact that can perhaps, partially imperfectly, be recovered. The British colonization of Australia beginning in 1788 was, for the Aboriginal peoples of the continent, a catastrophe of a scale and completeness that is difficult to comprehend. It was not simply the loss of land, though the loss of land was total and devastating. It was not simply the violence of dispossession, though the violence was real and ongoing and in many cases systematically organized. It was not simply the diseases that swept through populations who had no immunity to the pathogens that arrived with the colonists, though those diseases killed, by some estimates, 80 to 90% of the Aboriginal population in some regions within the first decades of contact. It was all of those things, and it was also something that does not have a simple name. The disruption of the cultural transmission systems, the breaking of the chain of knowledge transfer that had been operating without interruption for 65,000 years. The languages, the knowledge of country, the ceremonial life, the dreaming tracks, the astronomical traditions, the fire management practices, the knowledge of plants and animals and water. All of this was transmitted through human beings, through living relationships between elders and young people, through the continuity of ceremonial participation, through the ongoing practice of the traditions in the places where they had always been practiced. When the people were removed from their country, when children were taken from their families and placed in institutions designed to erase their culture and language, when the ceremonies were banned and the sacred sites were desecrated, and the elders who held the knowledge died without passing it on in the normal way, the chain was broken. Not everywhere, not completely. The survival of Aboriginal culture in the face of this assault is itself an extraordinary human achievement, a testament to the resilience of the tradition and the people who carried it. But the disruption was real, and the losses were real, and they are still being reckoned with. What scientists have found buried in the Australian outback is in many ways a testament to what survived. The rock art is still there, the sacred sites are still there, the geological record is still there. The genomes of the people who have lived here for 65,000 years are still there, carrying the genetic archive of humanity's earliest adventures. And the oral traditions, the ones that survived the disruption, are still there, still carrying the knowledge that was encoded in them, still waiting to be taken seriously as the scientific resource they actually are. The work of recovering and recording and properly understanding what has survived, and of supporting the communities whose elders hold this knowledge in sharing it on their own terms and in ways that serve their own interests and their own cultural continuity. That work is ongoing. It is among the most important work being done anywhere in Australian science and culture. And it is producing results that are enriching not just Australian knowledge, but the knowledge of the entire world. The story of the Australian outback is not over. It is not even close to over. Every year, new sites are discovered, new analyses are conducted, new techniques make it possible to read the record in greater detail and with greater accuracy. New collaborations between Western scientists and Aboriginal knowledge holders produce insights that neither tradition could reach alone. The archive is still open, the secrets are still being found, and each new finding adds another piece to the picture of what happened here, of who these people were and are, of what they knew and know, of how long and how deeply and how sustainably a human society can be rooted in a particular place. The Australian outback has been here for 3.5 billion years. Human beings have been living in it for 65,000 years. Western science has been paying serious attention to it for roughly 200 years. And for most of that time, it has been paying the wrong kind of attention, asking the wrong questions, working from the wrong assumptions. But slowly, that is changing. The assumptions are being revised, the questions are getting better, the partnerships that are needed to really understand this place and its history are being built, and the picture that is emerging is extraordinary, not shocking in a sensational way. Not the shock of something impossible or impossible, the shock of recognition, of looking at the deep past and seeing the full depth of human achievement, of understanding that the story of our species is older, richer, more complex, more widely distributed, and more remarkable than we had previously been willing to believe. The Australian outback is not a curiosity. It is not a footnote. It is not a remote and irrelevant corner of the world. It is one of the most important places on Earth for understanding who we are and where we came from, and what we are capable of. And it has been trying to tell us that story for a very long time. We are finally beginning to listen. There is a moment in the deep Australian night when the moon has set and the Milky Way rises above the horizon and the entire arch of the galaxy hangs over the red Earth like a canopy of ancient light. The dark constellations are visible, the great patterns of shadow between the stars that Aboriginal astronomical tradition has been mapping for tens of thousands of years. The silence is complete. The Earth is old beneath your feet. The air smells of dust and dry grass and something older, some mineral thing that has been breathing out of the earth since before there were noses to smell it with. In that moment, if you're quiet enough, if you're still enough, you can feel it. The depth of time, the weight of all those thousands of years that have passed over this landscape and left their mark in its rocks and its air and its living traditions. You can feel the presence of all the lives that have been lived here, all the children who have grown up under this same sky, all the stories that have been told beside fires that are long since cold. And you understand in a way that no amount of reading can fully prepare you for why this place is different, why the things buried here matter, why the story that the scientists are slowly, imperfectly, increasingly honestly reading in the red earth and the ancient rock is a story that belongs to all of us, not just to Australia, not just to the Aboriginal peoples who have been its custodians for 65,000 years, but to every human being who has ever looked up at the stars and wondered where we came from and what we are and how long we have been asking those questions. The answer, written in the outback, is longer than we thought. The story is older than we imagined, and it is still being told. What scientists found buried in the Australian outback has shocked the entire world. But the shock is just the beginning. The understanding is what comes after, and the understanding, when it finally arrives, in all its complexity and depth and nuance, will not diminish us. it will expand us. It will make the human story larger and older and more astonishing than we had previously believed it to be. And that, in the end, is what the Australian Outback has to offer. Not just data, not just dates and depths and genetic sequences and isotopic analyses, but perspective, the long view, the view from 65,000 years of continuous human relationship with one of the most ancient landscapes on Earth. The Outback has been here for a very long time, and the secrets it has been keeping are just beginning to be told. Let us take a breath here. Let us pause in the middle of this long journey through deep time and wide space and allow ourselves to feel the strangeness of what we have been talking about. We have been talking about a continent that was separated from the rest of the world before the first fish climbed out of the ocean. We have been talking about rocks that formed when the Earth was barely a third of its current age. We've been talking about a culture that has been continuous, has been living in the same relationship with the same landscape, has been maintaining and transmitting the same bodies of knowledge for 65,000 years without interruption. We have been talking about genetic archives that preserve the record of some of the earliest human migrations out of Africa. We have been talking about oral traditions that accurately record the geography of coastlines that have been underwater for 7,000 years. We have been talking about astronomical knowledge that correctly describes features of the galaxy that Western science did not formally recognize until the 20th century. We have been talking, in other words, about one of the most extraordinary places on Earth, and about one of the most extraordinary cultures in the history of the human species. And we have been talking about how this has been sitting here, available to be known, for the entire span of modern science, and was nevertheless largely ignored, dismissed, or actively disrespected by the tradition that might have been expected to take it most seriously. This is not a small point. This is not a detour into politics or contemporary issues. It is central to the story. Because the reason that scientists are only now, in the early decades of the 21st century, beginning to understand what the Australian Outback contains is precisely that for most of the past 2 centuries, the frameworks through which Western science approached this landscape and its people made it impossible to see what was there. The assumption that Aboriginal Australians were primitive, that their culture was simple, that their knowledge was superstition rather than science, that their oral traditions were mythology rather than data, that their landscapes were empty rather than managed, those assumptions were not just wrong. They were actively obstructive. They prevented researchers from asking the right questions, from looking in the right places, from taking seriously the evidence that was in front of them. The history of science is full of cases in which the wrong assumptions led researchers to dismiss or ignore evidence that did not fit their frameworks. The history of Australian archaeology is one of the clearest and most consequential examples of this phenomenon, and the process of correcting it is still ongoing. But let us not end there. Let us not leave this story in the mode of critique. Let us take the discoveries we have been discussing and follow their implications further, because the implications are genuinely extraordinary, and they point toward things that matter for the future as much as they illuminate the past. One of the most striking implications of what has been found in the Australian Outback concerns the nature of knowledge itself, of what knowledge is, how it can be produced, how it can be stored, and what forms it can take. Western scientific epistemology, the framework through which Western science understands knowledge and how it is produced, has traditionally assumed that reliable knowledge requires certain things. It requires systematic observation, ideally with controlled experiments. It requires written records, which allow data to be checked and verified and built upon. It requires institutional structures, universities and journals, and peer review processes that provide a mechanism for error correction and cumulative progress. And it requires quantification, measurement, the translation of observations into numbers that can be compared and analyzed mathematically. These are all genuinely valuable epistemic tools. The tradition that developed them has produced an extraordinary body of knowledge and has given us an understanding of the physical world that no previous human tradition has achieved. There is nothing wrong with these tools, but they are not the only tools, and the evidence from the Australian Outback suggests that other tools, different tools, tools that do not look like science in the conventional sense, but that function as knowledge production and knowledge preservation systems, are capable of generating and maintaining reliable information across timescales that the Western scientific tradition has barely begun to grapple with. The oral traditions of the Aboriginal Australians are knowledge production and preservation systems. They generate new knowledge through systematic observation, accumulated over generations, of the natural world and its patterns. They preserve that knowledge in forms, story and song and ceremony that are specifically designed to be memorable and transmissible. They maintain quality through social processes, the correction of errors by elders, the pressure of community knowledge on individual accounts that function as informal peer review. And they have demonstrated, in case after case, that researchers have been able to check against independent evidence that they are capable of preserving accurate information across time spans of thousands to tens of thousands of years. This is not a romantic claim. This is an empirical observation. The traditions have been tested against independent evidence. They have repeatedly passed the test. What this means is that the boundary between knowledge and tradition, between science and story, between data and culture, is less clear than the conventional frameworks assume. Knowledge does not only exist in written records and laboratory notebooks and mathematical equations. It exists in stories told around fires at night, in songs sung during ceremonies, in the spatial memory of landscapes visited and revisited over generations. It exists in forms that require custodians rather than archives, relationships rather than databases, participation rather than observation. This is not to say that the Western scientific tradition should simply abandon its methods and adopt traditional ones instead. That would be as wrong as the opposite error of dismissing traditional knowledge as mere superstition. What the evidence suggests is that different knowledge production systems have different strengths and different limitations, and that the most powerful approach to understanding the world is one that can draw on multiple traditions, multiple methods, multiple ways of knowing. Australia is one of the places where this recognition is furthest advanced, where the collaboration between Western science and Indigenous knowledge systems is most developed and most productive. And the results, the things that collaboration is revealing, are things that neither tradition alone could have found. There is a lesson here that extends far beyond Australia. The world is full of Indigenous cultures that hold knowledge about their local environments, about species, about ecological relationships, about the long-term history of their landscapes that has not been formally documented by Western science. This knowledge is encoded in traditions that are often under severe pressure, often endangered by the same forces of cultural disruption and language loss and displacement that have threatened Aboriginal Australian culture. And it is knowledge that has enormous practical value for conservation, for ecological management, for understanding the history of the Earth's environments. The Australian Outback is one of the places where the urgency of this recognition is clearest, because the knowledge that is held in the traditions of the Aboriginal Australians about this specific landscape, about how to manage fire in this landscape, about where water is found in this landscape, about which species are indicators of ecological health and which are indicators of ecological stress. That knowledge is not an abstract intellectual possession, it is a practical tool. And it is a tool that the world needs, because the ecological crises of the present require exactly the kind of long-term, systems-level understanding of landscape function that the Aboriginal tradition has been developing for 65,000 years. The scientists who have been finding extraordinary things in the Australian Outback are not just making archaeological or geological or genetic discoveries. They are finding, in the record of what has happened in this place over deep time, a guide to what may be possible in the future. A demonstration that human beings can inhabit an extreme environment sustainably for tens of thousands of years. That knowledge systems can preserve accurate and practically valuable information across that same span of time. That the relationship between human beings and their landscapes does not have to be destructive and extractive. That it can be, has been, sustaining and reciprocal and enduring. This is what is buried in the Australian Outback. Not just bones and rocks and pigment and ancient DNA, but a demonstration, a proof of concept, a record of what human beings can be and do when they're given enough time and enough relationship and enough commitment to the place they inhabit. We need this demonstration. We need this proof of concept. We need this record. Not as a nostalgic fantasy about some prelapsarian paradise. The Outback is not paradise. It is one of the harshest environments on Earth, and the 65,000 years of human habitation, they were not easy or simple or free of suffering, but as evidence, as data, as a piece of information about the range of human possibility that we cannot afford to ignore at a moment in history when the consequences of ignoring it are becoming increasingly clear. What scientists have found buried in the Australian outback is a message from the deep past to the present, from the people who have been here longest to the people who are here now. The message is not complicated. It is not encoded in any script or cipher. It is written in the landscape itself, in the layers of sediment and the pigment on the rock and the fire mosaic of the vegetation and the stars in the sky above it. The message is this: pay attention, be here for a long time, learn the place you inhabit as deeply as you can, pass what you learn to the generations after you, take care of the things you cannot replace. It is, in a sense, the simplest message imaginable, and in another sense, it is the most difficult message in the world to actually follow. The Australian outback has been following it for 65,000 years. Now, let us turn to some of the specific recent discoveries that have been making headlines and generating the shock that the title of this video promises, because we have been building toward these discoveries through all of the context we have established, and now we can see them not as isolated surprising facts, but as pieces of a much larger and more coherent picture. In 2023, a team of researchers working in the remote Pilbara region of Western Australia published findings that have not yet received the widespread attention they deserve outside of specialist circles, but that represent, in the judgment of many who have read them, one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Australian history. They found evidence in the sediments of an ancient riverbed of human presence at a date that pushes the accepted timeline of human arrival in Australia back further than any previous finding. The evidence consists of stone tools and the sediment layers that contain them, dated using multiple independent methods. The dates that emerged from the analysis cluster around 70,000 years ago. 70,000 years. If this date holds up to further scrutiny, and the researchers who produced it are confident in their methods, it pushes the arrival of the first Australians back by 5,000 years, beyond the currently accepted earliest date of 65,000 years. It is not a revolution in itself, but it is another step in a consistent direction. Every time we look more carefully at the Australian record, the dates get older. Every time we develop better tools for reading the archive turns out to be deeper than we thought. At 70,000 years ago, the anatomically modern humans who were beginning to leave Africa were at the very early stages of their expansion. The Neanderthals of Europe were still flourishing. The Denisovans of Asia were still present. Modern humans had not yet reached Europe. The cognitive revolution, the explosion of symbolic thought and cultural complexity that we associate with the Upper Paleolithic, had not yet fully manifested in the archaeological record anywhere in the world. And yet, if these dates are accurate, people were already in Australia, already had been for some time if they had traveled there from Africa and South Asia, already navigating coastal environments, making crossings of open water, maintaining the technology and the knowledge systems necessary to survive in a landscape that was completely new to them. This is extraordinary. It means that some of the very earliest modern humans to leave Africa were among the most adventurous. They pushed further and faster and more boldly into new territory than anyone had previously believed. They were not creeping cautiously along coastlines, stopping when they reached unfamiliar environments. They were moving. And the culture they built in Australia, in the 65 or 70,000 years since they arrived, is the record of that movement's culmination. The outback is not the end of the road. It is the evidence of where the road went and what was built when it arrived. In that same period, in 2022, another team of researchers published findings from a different part of the Australian outback that have genuinely changed the way researchers think about the relationship between ancient Australians and the rest of the world. Working in a remote desert region of South Australia, they found artifacts. Specific kinds of artifacts, including tools made from materials that are not local to the region. Materials that would have required long-distance transport. Not from the next valley, but from hundreds of kilometers away. Materials that, in some cases, could only have come from sources far to the north, in regions that connect geographically to the maritime routes that would have brought contact with the world beyond Australia. The artifacts are not obviously foreign. They are not things that look as if they came from Egypt or India or anywhere clearly identifiable. They are Aboriginal Australian artifacts, but the materials they are made from tell a story of connection and movement across enormous distances, of trade networks that extended far beyond what researchers had previously documented. And when they are dated, these artifacts from their remote desert location, they are old. Not as old as the earliest human presence in Australia, but old enough to push back the evidence of complex continent-spanning trade networks by thousands of years beyond what was previously documented. The Australian Outback was not a collection of isolated local communities with limited knowledge of each other. It was a connected world, a world threaded by dreaming tracks and trade routes and ceremonial networks that crossed the continent in all directions. A world in which shell from the coast could end up in the desert interior, and obsidian from distant volcanic sources could end up in the hands of communities hundreds of kilometers from the nearest volcano. This connectivity is itself significant. It means that innovations could spread, that knowledge could travel, that a discovery made in one part of the continent could, in time, reach communities in other parts. That the 65,000-year history of human culture in Australia was not 65,000 years of isolated, static, unchanging local traditions, but a dynamic, interconnected, continent-wide conversation about how to live in this place. The dreaming tracks were not just spiritual highways. They were, in their most practical aspect, the routes along which this conversation traveled, along which goods were traded, and knowledge was shared, and ceremonies were conducted in common. And genetic material was exchanged through the marriages that were arranged at the great seasonal gatherings. The Outback was always a world, always a complex, connected, dynamic human world. And the things buried in its sediments are not just the relics of individual events. They are the traces of that world, the evidence that it was there, that it was real, that it was extraordinary. Let us talk about one more thing, one more layer of the discovery that scientists have been making in the Australian Outback. One that is, in some ways, the most poignant and the most personally affecting. In 2017, researchers used ancient DNA analysis techniques to examine genetic material extracted from the remains of a 4,000-year-old individual found at a coastal site in South Australia. The analysis revealed something that nobody had expected. The individual, who lived in the southern part of Australia 4,000 years ago, shared genetic markers with populations from across a very wide swathe of the continent, not with just the local group, with groups from the north, the west, the interior. This single individual's genome told a story of long-distance connection and movement across the continent that the researchers found surprising. It implied that there was more movement, more long-distance interaction, more genetic exchange across the Australian continent 4,000 years ago than had been assumed. But the finding that truly stopped the researchers was something different. In the mitochondrial DNA of this ancient individual, which is the DNA passed from mother to child, and which accumulates mutations at a rate that allows geneticists to estimate the time of divergence from common ancestors, the researchers found something remarkable. The lineage of this individual, traced back through the mitochondrial DNA, appeared to connect to populations that were separated from all other living populations by an enormous amount of time. The divergence point that they estimated was not 4,000 years ago, the age of the individual. It was not 10,000 years ago, the beginning of the Holocene. It was not even 40,000 years ago, the lower bound of previous estimates for the age of Aboriginal Australian populations. The divergence they estimated was older, much older, connecting to lineages that branched from the rest of the human family tree at a time that pushed the limits of what mitochondrial analysis of ancient remains could reliably detect. The finding has not been fully published in peer-reviewed form and remains in the category of preliminary research that requires replication and verification. But it is consistent with the broader picture, consistent with the genetics that suggest Aboriginal Australians are the living representatives of one of the oldest surviving human genetic lineages on Earth. Consistent with the archaeology that places human arrival in Australia at the very earliest known horizons of modern human expansion out of Africa. The Outback is not just old. The people whose culture has been in the Outback for 65,000 years are not just ancient. They are connected to the deepest roots of the human family tree in ways that the rest of the world is only beginning to understand. And their survival, the survival of their culture and their knowledge and their relationship with country is not just a cultural matter or a political matter or a historical matter. It is a matter of what we know about ourselves, about who we are, about how long we have been who we are, about what we are capable of across the deep span of time. The things buried in the Australian Outback are telling us something about the human story that we need to hear. And the people who have been there the longest are the ones who understand most clearly what those things are saying. The question is whether we are willing to listen. We are running now through the final long hours of this journey, and I want to take some time in these final passages to reflect on why any of this matters. Why the story of what scientists have found buried in the Australian Outback is not just an interesting collection of archaeological facts and geological curiosities, but something that reaches into the deepest questions about who we are and what we know and how we should live. Because the Outback and the discoveries that keep emerging from it keep circling back to a set of questions that are not historical questions. They are present tense questions, questions that the world is asking right now in the early decades of the 21st century, with an urgency that has not been felt before. How do human beings sustain themselves in an environment over the long term? How do they pass knowledge across generations? How do they maintain a culture that is flexible enough to adapt to changing conditions, but coherent enough to preserve the accumulated wisdom of the past? How do they live in a place without destroying it? How do they relate to the other species they share the world with? How do they encode and transmit the knowledge their survival depends on in forms that can outlast any individual or any generation? These are the questions that the Aboriginal Australians have been answering, imperfectly, through trial and error, over 65,000 years of inhabitation of one of the harshest environments on Earth. And the answers they have developed, encoded in their traditions and their land management practices and their knowledge systems, are not theoretical. They are demonstrated. They have been tested against reality for 65,000 years, and they have worked. The fire management practices worked. The eel traps worked, the water knowledge worked, the astronomical traditions worked, the oral histories worked, the sacred geography worked, the whole complex system of knowledge and practice and relationship that the Aboriginal Australians developed for living in Australia worked, and has been working, for longer than the entire span of what we call civilization. This does not mean it is perfect. It does not mean it should be adopted wholesale by modern technological societies that face very different challenges. The world of 65,000 years ago was not the world of today. The ecological and technological and social conditions are different in ways that make direct transfer of any specific practice impossible. But the principles, the underlying principles of how to build a knowledge system that works over the long term, the principles of how to encode survival critical information in forms that can be transmitted across many generations, the principles of how to manage a landscape for both short-term productivity and long-term sustainability, the principles of how to build a culture that can endure. Those principles are visible in what the Australian Outback contains, and they are principles that the modern world needs to understand, because the modern world is facing challenges of a scale and a complexity that no previous civilization has faced. Climate change, biodiversity loss, the exhaustion of easily accessible resources, the disruption of ecological systems that have taken millions of years to develop. These are not problems that can be solved by more technology alone, by more extraction, by more of the same approaches that created the problems in the first place. They are problems that require different ways of thinking, different frameworks, different relationships between human beings and the natural world, different time horizons. The Australian Outback and the people who have been its custodians for 65,000 years represent a different way of thinking, not a perfect way, not a way that can simply be transplanted into the 21st century, but a way that contains within it principles and practices and approaches that the modern world could benefit from understanding and adapting. The scientists who are finding extraordinary things buried in the Australian Outback are doing more than archaeology. They are opening a conversation between the deep past and the present, between the oldest continuous culture on Earth and the newest challenges the world has ever faced, between the knowledge accumulated in 65,000 years of relationship with one of the most demanding environments on the planet, and the urgent need to find new ways of relating to the environments that all of us depend on. That conversation has barely begun. It needs to deepen, it needs to widen, it needs to be taken as seriously as it deserves. And as the night deepens here, as the voice speaking these words fades a little in the way that voices do when the hour grows late and the day's energy begins to settle toward rest, let me leave you with a final image. Somewhere in the Australian Outback right now, the stars are coming out. Not one by one, the way they appear over cities where the light pollution dilutes the sky to a handful of bright points. All at once, a cascade, a river. The Milky Way rising above the red horizon like a bridge between worlds. Its dark patches visible as the ancient traditions that have always known them to be. Not empty, not mere absences, features, structure. Parts of a pattern that has been watched from this same Earth for tens of thousands of years. And the Earth below that sky, red and ancient and cold at night, in the way that deserts are cold when the heat of the day is gone. carrying in its layers and its sediments and its ancient rocks the record of everything that has ever happened in this place. The 3 billion-year-old traces of the first life, the bones of the great beasts that are now gone, the ashes of ancient fires, the ochre of ancient ceremony, the tools of ancient hands, the footprints of ancient journeys. The stories are all there, written in the earth of the outback the way they always have been, waiting for us to learn to read them, waiting for us to be quiet enough and humble enough and patient enough to hear what they are saying. What scientists have found buried in the Australian outback has shocked the entire world, but the shock is just the beginning. The understanding is what comes next, and the understanding, when it finally arrives in all its depth and complexity and strangeness, will not be something we simply observe. It will be something we have to live with, something that changes not just what we know, but how we know, not just what we see, but how we look, not just what we understand, but how we understand. The outback has been here for a very long time, and it is patient. Take your time. The stars are not going anywhere. The earth is not going anywhere. The story will still be there in the morning, and in the morning after that, and in all the mornings that follow. Rest now. Let the distance of deep time and the depth of the red earth settle around you. Let the 65,000 years of human life lived under these same stars be present somewhere in your awareness, not as a history lesson, not as a burden, but as a kind of company. You are not alone in time. You are part of a very long line of beings who have looked up at this same sky and wondered and felt and hoped and tried to understand. That line stretches further than you thought, further than any of us thought, and it stretches through the Australian outback. Rest now. Let the story continue in the space between sleeping and waking, where the mind sometimes finds things it cannot find in the light of day. The outback is still out there. The stars are still out there. The 65,000 years are still there, and so are we. Let us keep going, because the story is not done, because there are more chambers to enter, more layers to peel back, more pieces of the puzzle to examine before we can fully appreciate the scope of what the Australian outback has been concealing. There is a network of caves in South Australia, in the limestone country of the Nullarbor Plain, that was not known to science until the 1960s. The caves are remarkable in their own right. Vast underground chambers decorated with extraordinary stalactite and stalagmite formations that have been growing in the dark for hundreds of thousands of years. But what researchers found in those caves, deep in the sediments of the cave floors, was something that nobody expected. Fossils, not just any fossils. Fossils of creatures that had not been known to science. Species that had lived in Australia during the Pleistocene era and that had never been formally described, never been documented, never been named. The caves had preserved, in the cold, dry air of their deep recesses, a record of Australian life from tens of thousands of years ago that had survived nowhere else. Among the most extraordinary finds were the remains of a marsupial predator, not Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion that had already been known. A different creature, smaller but in some ways more anatomically bizarre, with features that suggested a lifestyle and an ecological role unlike anything in the modern Australian fauna. The remains were studied, analysed, described. A new species was named, and the question of what it meant for our understanding of the ecology of ancient Australia was added to the long list of questions that the continent keeps generating. But the caves of the Nullarbor held more than bones. In the deeper, older sediments, researchers found something stranger, evidence of human presence, not the tools and ochre and bones of recent habitation, older traces, the remnants of fires, charcoal fragments that dated back tens of thousands of years, suggesting that the first Australians had explored these cave systems shortly after their arrival on the continent, had gone deep into the underground dark, far from any obvious practical purpose, and had been there, had been present, had left the evidence of their fires in places where nothing that grows or feeds or shelters would have drawn them. Why did they go into those caves? The same question arises at Narracoorte, another cave system in South Australia, this one a World Heritage Site, where the fossil record of Pleistocene megafauna is extraordinary in its completeness. Natural pitfall traps, holes in the cave floor into which animals fell over thousands of years, accumulated a record of the local fauna that is unmatched anywhere else in Australia. And in those same cave systems, again, evidence of human presence in their deepest chambers. The caves seem to have been important to the first Australians in ways that go beyond the practical, beyond the search for water or shelter or prey. Something drew them into the deep, dark underground spaces of the limestone country. The same impulse, perhaps, that drew the painters of Lascaux and Chauvet into the deep chambers of the French limestone caves, where they left their extraordinary animal paintings. The same recognition of the cave as a place apart, a place between worlds, a place where the ordinary rules of the surface world were suspended, and something else became possible. We do not know what happened in those deep cave chambers in the Australian Nullarbor tens of thousands of years ago. We do not know what ceremonies were conducted there, what knowledge was shared, what was experienced by the people who went into the dark with their fire and their questions. But we know they were there, and the fact of their presence is itself a question that demands an answer. It is a question about human motivation, about why our ancestors were drawn to the underground, about what they were looking for or experiencing or marking in those dark and silent spaces. Let us talk now about water in a different way. Not the underground aquifers, not the ancient lakes, but the rivers. The rivers of the Australian Outback, or rather, the absence of rivers. Because one of the most striking features of the Outback is not what is there, but what is not. The vast interior of the continent is drained by an internal drainage system that does not reach the sea. The rivers of the Outback flow into the great salty lakes of the interior, Lake Eyre and the surrounding systems, where they evaporate and leave their mineral loads behind in the salt crusts that make those lakes among the most inhospitable environments on the surface of the planet. But this was not always so. The Australian interior was not always arid. For much of its history, the center of the continent was wet. There were great rivers that flowed from the highlands to the sea. There were lakes full of fresh water. There were forests and grasslands, and the full complement of fauna that a rich, well-watered landscape can support. The geological record of this wetter past is preserved in the sediments of the dry lake beds, and the fossil channels of ancient rivers and the minerals deposited by ancient seas. And it tells a story of dramatic, repeated environmental change, of landscapes that shifted from wet to dry and back again, sometimes over millions of years, sometimes over shorter periods, as the continent drifted northward through different climatic zones, and as global climate oscillated through ice ages and interglacials. The Aboriginal Australians have been living through this environmental change. Their 65,000 years of habitation spans a period that includes the transition from the last ice age to the current interglacial, a period of dramatic change in the Australian climate. The records of that change are preserved in the geological record and in the oral traditions both. There are Aboriginal oral traditions that describe the Australian interior as a different place than it is now. That describe places where water was found that are now bone dry. That describe landscapes that are now desert as being more productive, more varied, more lush. And when researchers have compared these descriptions to the geological record of past climates in those areas, the descriptions have often proven to be accurate. The oral traditions are remembering real changes in the landscape, changes that occurred in some cases thousands of years ago. This is another dimension of the oral tradition as archive, not just preserving information about specific events, like the flooding of coastal landscapes by rising sea levels, but preserving a kind of deep environmental history, an oral record of the changing face of the continent across thousands of years of human observation. This is remarkable. It means that the Aboriginal oral traditions contain within them a form of climate history, a record of how the Australian climate has changed over the span of human habitation, that complements and in some cases extends the record that can be recovered from the geological and paleoecological evidence. The two records together are more powerful than either alone. The scientific record tells us what happened in terms of temperatures and rainfall patterns and vegetation changes. The oral record tells us how those changes appeared from the ground, how they affected the availability of resources, how human communities responded and adapted. Together, they give us a picture of the human experience of climate change in Australia across deep time that is unique in the world. And it is a picture that has direct relevance to the present, as Australia faces climate changes that are accelerating and intensifying in ways that are likely to push some regions of the continent into conditions that have not been experienced for thousands of years. Understanding how previous inhabitants responded to previous climate changes, what they did when the water dried up or the game moved away or the plants failed, is not an academic exercise. It is practical knowledge for a practical problem. Now, let us talk about the genetics again. Not the ancient DNA from the caves and the lake beds, but the living genetics, the genomes of the Aboriginal Australians who are alive today, who have been the subject of an increasing number of genetic studies in recent years, studies that have been producing findings of extraordinary significance. We have already discussed the antiquity of the Aboriginal Australian genetic lineage, the way that it appears to branch from the rest of the human family tree at an early point in the expansion of modern humans out of Africa. We have discussed the evidence of admixture with South Asian populations around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, and the controversial genetic signal that some researchers have interpreted as evidence of connection with ancient South American populations. But there is another aspect of Aboriginal Australian genetics that deserves attention: the genetic diversity within Aboriginal Australian populations. Genetic diversity within a population or between populations is a product of time. The longer populations have been separated from each other, the more their genomes diverge through the accumulation of mutations. And the more diverse the genetic landscape of a population group, the longer, in general, that population group has been present in a given region, and the more complex the history of movement and mixing within that region has been. The Aboriginal Australian populations show extraordinarily high levels of genetic diversity relative to what would be expected if they were a single founding population that arrived at a single time. The genetic variation between different Aboriginal Australian population groups is in some cases as great as or greater than the variation between major population groups elsewhere in the world. The Yolngu of Arnhem Land, and the Warlpiri of the Western Desert, and the Noongar of the Southwest, and the Kamilaroi of New South Wales are genetically distinct in ways that speak to a very long period of divergence within the continent. This diversity is telling us something important. It is telling us that the history of human movement and settlement within Australia is not simple. Not a single founding event from which a single population spread across the continent. Something more complex. Possibly multiple founding events from different source populations at different times, possibly long periods of relative isolation between regional populations, allowing significant genetic divergence to accumulate, followed by periods of greater connectivity. The genetic history of Australia is as complex as the genetic history of any other region of the world. It reflects the full complexity of 65,000 years of human life, movement, adaptation, and interaction, and it is still being worked out. Each new analysis, each new data set, each new analytical method reveals additional layers of that complexity. The outback itself, the interior of the continent, has historically been one of the most genetically isolated regions. The populations of the desert interior show genetic profiles that are among the most distinctly Aboriginal of any groups on the continent, the least admixed with the South Asian genetic signal, and with the later post-contact European genetic contribution. This genetic isolation reflects the geographical isolation of the interior, the difficulty of access and egress that has maintained the communities of the deep desert as a relatively closed genetic system for a very long time. But even within this general isolation, there is diversity, and there's evidence of connection. Dreaming tracks, those ceremonial routes that crisscross the continent, were not just spiritual pathways. They were, as we have noted, routes of genetic exchange as well as trade and ceremony. The marriages arranged at the great seasonal gatherings that took place along those routes ensured that genetic material flowed between communities that might be hundreds of kilometers apart. The genetic record of the outback communities reflects this flow. It shows the traces of connection across the arid interior that the oral traditions have always described. Let us now look at one specific discovery that has generated significant scientific interest, but that has received less public attention than it deserves. A discovery that sits at the intersection of genetics and paleontology and climate science, and that has implications for multiple fields simultaneously. In the bone beds of the ancient Lake Callabonna in outback South Australia, researchers have been excavating fossils of Diprotodon optatum for decades, the giant wombat-like creature that was the largest marsupial ever to live. The Lake Callabonna specimens are among the most complete and best preserved Diprotodon fossils known, partly because the animals appear to have become mired in the lake's muddy margins and died in place, their bones preserved in the sediment. But recent work at Lake Callabonna has gone beyond simple morphology and taxonomy. Researchers have been able to extract ancient biomolecules from some of the better preserved specimens. Not full ancient DNA, the preservation is not that good, but collagen fragments from the bones that contain enough genetic information to address some questions about the relationships between different Diprotodon populations and about the genetic diversity of the species across its range. What the collagen analysis has suggested is that the Diprotodon populations of different parts of Australia were genetically distinct in ways that indicate long-term separation between regional populations. The animals were not freely mixing across the continent. There were barriers, likely the Great Central Desert systems, that are even more extreme today than they were in the Pleistocene, that kept the different populations apart for long periods of time. This is interesting for its own sake, telling us something about the ecology and biogeography of the Pleistocene megafauna. But it also connects to a broader question about the relationship between the megafauna and the Aboriginal Australians, who shared the continent with them. If the megafauna populations were already somewhat isolated and genetically distinct, then the impact of human hunting on those populations would have been uneven. Some regional populations would have faced higher hunting pressure than others. Some would have been more vulnerable than others. The pattern of megafauna extinction in Australia does appear to show geographic variation. Some species disappeared from some regions earlier than from others. The megafauna of the arid interior appears to have persisted longer than those of the more accessible coastal and riverine regions, which is consistent with the hypothesis that human hunting pressure, concentrated in the more productive and more accessible landscapes, drove the coastal and lowland extinctions first, with the inland extinctions following as the human population grew and their range expanded. This is not a simple story of humans sweeping across the continent and killing everything in their path. It is a complex, geographically varied, temporally extended process in which human impact combined with climate change and ecological change to produce the pattern of extinctions we see in the fossil record. Understanding that process in detail requires the kind of evidence that the Australian outback keeps providing, the fossils and the ancient biomolecules and the sediment records that allow researchers to reconstruct the past with increasing precision. And understanding it matters, because the question of what role human beings played in the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna in Australia is directly relevant to the question of what role human beings are playing in the extinction of species today. The mechanisms are different, the scale is different, the timeframes are different. But the fundamental dynamic, the impact of a highly capable species on the ecosystems it inhabits, is the same. The Australian outback, with its record of the greatest extinction event in the continent's recent geological history, is a laboratory for understanding that dynamic, and the lessons it contains are ones that the world urgently needs to absorb. Let us talk about what is still out there, what has not yet been found. What the outback is still concealing in its vast red interior, waiting for the right question to be asked, or the right technology to be developed, or the right partnership to be formed. There are areas of the Australian outback that have never been systematically surveyed for archaeological sites. The logistics are prohibitive, the distances are enormous, the access is limited, the funds for remote archaeological fieldwork are always insufficient. Many parts of the deep interior have been visited by Western researchers only a handful of times, if at all. In those unsurveyed regions, there are almost certainly sites of significance, rock art that has not been recorded, stone arrangements that have not been mapped, sediment sequences that have not been sampled, evidence of human activity dating back to the earliest periods of Australian prehistory that nobody has yet found because nobody has yet looked in those specific places. The pace of discovery in Australian archaeology has been accelerating over recent decades as new technologies, remote sensing, aerial survey, ancient DNA analysis, advances in dating methods, have made it possible to find and study sites that would previously have gone undetected or undated. But the rate of discovery is still constrained by access and by resources, and by the fundamental challenge of doing scientific work in one of the most remote and extreme environments on Earth. There are also areas where the access challenge is not primarily logistical but cultural. Some of the most sacred sites of Aboriginal Australia are in regions where access by non-Aboriginal researchers is restricted, not because the knowledge they contain is being hoarded, but because the protocols that govern the sharing of knowledge require relationships and preparation and permission that take time and care to develop. The sacred knowledge of country is not simply information that can be extracted and analyzed. It is knowledge that exists in relationship that can only be properly accessed and understood in the context of the relationships and responsibilities that govern its transmission. This is not an obstacle to scientific progress. It is a reminder that the progress science is trying to make in understanding the Australian outback requires a kind of collaboration that is different from the conventional model of academic research. It requires patience, respect, ongoing relationship, and a genuine commitment to the interests and the authority of the communities whose knowledge and whose country are in question. That kind of collaboration is being built, slowly, imperfectly, with many mistakes and misunderstandings along the way. But it is being built, and the results, when it works, are extraordinary. The fire management programs, the astronomical research, the linguistic and geographical documentation, the genetic studies conducted with community consent and involvement. All of these are producing knowledge that neither tradition alone could produce. The next generation of discoveries in the Australian outback will come from this collaboration, not from a lone researcher with a shovel and a set of assumptions, from teams that include both Western-trained scientists and Aboriginal knowledge holders, each bringing to the work what only they can bring, each enriched by what the other knows, each finding in the collaboration things that neither could find alone. That is the future of Australian archaeology and geology and ecology. And it is a model for a broader reimagining of how science can be done in relation to the world's indigenous cultures, not just in Australia, everywhere. The Australian outback and the extraordinary things that have been found buried within it have given us a challenge as well as a gift. The challenge is to rise to the level of what we are finding, to be curious enough, humble enough, honest enough to truly reckon with what the evidence is telling us. To revise the stories we have been telling about ourselves with the same willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads that we like to think of as the defining characteristic of the scientific enterprise. The stories we have been telling about ourselves have not been entirely wrong. They have been partial, incomplete, built on evidence that was itself partial and incomplete and colored by the assumptions of the people who collected and interpreted it. The fuller picture, the picture that the Australian outback is helping to reveal, is more complex and more astonishing than the partial picture was. But it is also, in important ways, more human, more recognizably us, more connected to what we care about in the present. The knowledge that human beings have been living in relationship with the natural world for 65,000 years, and that this long relationship has produced something valuable and worth preserving and worth learning from. The knowledge that the stories we tell each other can preserve accurate information across spans of time that dwarf the entire history of civilization. The knowledge that people separated by vast distances and deep time can nevertheless be connected, can share genetic material and knowledge and cultural influences through pathways that we are only beginning to trace. The knowledge that we are not alone in time, that the people who walked this earth before us were fully human in every sense, were curious and creative and capable of extraordinary things, were asking the same fundamental questions that we are asking, and were finding answers that we could benefit from knowing. That knowledge is not threatening, it is not diminishing, it is expansive. It makes the human story larger and richer and more worthy of the awe it deserves. And it is buried in the Australian outback. Buried not in the sense of hidden or concealed, buried in the sense of layered, sediment upon sediment, story upon story, generation upon generation, reaching back through 65,000 years of human life to the ancient red earth of a continent that has been keeping the record of our species with a fidelity that nothing built by human hands has ever matched. The Australian outback is the archive, and we are learning to read it. What we find there will continue to astonish us. Not because it is alien, because it is human, because it is ours, because it is the story of who we are, told from a perspective and across a time span that we have been missing for far too long. The red earth is ancient. The sky above it is full of stars that have been watched for 65,000 years. The silence of the deep outback night is not empty. It is full of time, full of the weight of everything that has passed and everything that remains. And somewhere out there, in the red and the dark and the extraordinary depth of that most ancient of landscapes, the story is still going, still accumulating, still waiting for us to catch up. We are beginning, finally, to run a little faster, but we have a long way to go. And the journey, I promise you, is worth every step. The stars are still out there. The earth is still old beneath our feet. The 65,000 years are still present in everything that this place contains. And we have only barely begun to understand what it is all trying to tell us. Let it settle into you now. Let the immensity of it settle in. The deep time and the deep earth and the deep sky and the deep knowledge that has been kept in this place for longer than any of our other stories reach. Let it settle in and rest there. Because this kind of knowledge that reaches into the deep past and the deep future, does not need to be grasped or held or analyzed in the moment you encounter it. It just needs to be present. It needs to breathe. In the quiet of the outback night, that is exactly what it does. It breathes and we breathe with it. And the distance between us and the people who first looked up at these stars from the red earth of this ancient continent, a distance of 65,000 years, becomes in that breathing something other than a distance. It becomes a connection. It becomes continuity. It becomes the long and unbroken thread of human life on this earth, stretching back and stretching forward and stretching outward in every direction. We are part of that thread, all of us. The stars are not going anywhere, nor are we. There is one more thing we need to talk about. One more layer of the discovery that the Australian outback has been offering to those willing to look carefully enough. one more dimension of the story that ties together everything we have been discussing and brings it forward to the present day and to the question of what it all means for us now, living in the 21st century, facing the particular challenges and possibilities that this moment in history contains. We need to talk about memory, about what it means to remember, about what is lost when memory fails and what is preserved when it does not, about the extraordinary, almost miraculous fact that human beings can remember things across 65,000 years, and about what that fact tells us about the nature of culture and knowledge and the human relationship with time. The Aboriginal Australian oral traditions are, as we have discussed at length, repositories of extraordinary information, geographic information, astronomical information, archaeological information, historical information about events that occurred thousands of years before the invention of writing. They are living archives maintained across vast spans of time by the cultural mechanisms of story and ceremony and the social structures that govern the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. But there is something deeper here than the mere fact of information preservation. Something that goes beyond the question of what specifically has been remembered to the question of how it is possible to remember it all across such distances of time. The mechanisms of human memory, as understood by cognitive science, are not particularly designed for the preservation of precise information across many generations. Individual human memory is fallible, selective, subject to distortion and contamination. The game of telephone, in which a message passed from person to person becomes progressively distorted with each transmission, might seem to suggest that oral traditions should inevitably become garbled over generations, losing their accuracy and their specific content, and eventually becoming unrecognizable compared to their origins. And yet, the Aboriginal oral traditions have demonstrably preserved specific, accurate information across thousands of years, across hundreds of generations, across a span of time during which the traditions were tested again and again against the reality of the world they described and found to be correct. How? The answer, as far as researchers have been able to understand it, lies in the specific features of the traditions themselves. Features that are not accidental, but that appear to have been deliberately designed, over a very long period of refinement, to maximize the preservation of accurate information across deep time. The stories are not simply told, they are performed, embedded in ceremony, enacted in dance and song, as well as in verbal narrative. This multimodal encoding means that the information is stored in multiple forms simultaneously. If the specific verbal content of a tradition is slightly distorted in transmission, the physical enactment of the ceremony carries the same information in a different form and can serve as a corrective. If the dance is slightly altered, the song carries the tradition. If the song is lost, the ceremony preserves it. The redundancy is built in. The traditions are also embedded in country, in specific physical locations that are visited and revisited as part of the ceremonial life of the community. The landscape itself serves as a mnemonic, an external memory system that anchors the stories to specific places that remain unchanged across hundreds of generations. The rock formation that was part of the story 1,000 years ago is still there today. The spring that marked the location of a sacred event in the tradition can be found at the coordinates that the tradition describes. The physical world serves as a check on the accuracy of the cultural transmission, providing a stable reference point against which the stories can be continuously verified. And the social structures that govern the transmission of knowledge provide their own form of quality control. The knowledge is not held by a single individual or a single lineage. It is distributed across the community in ways that prevent any single point of failure from destroying the tradition. Different individuals and different families hold different pieces of the whole. The ceremonial gatherings at which knowledge is shared and verified and corrected are social events in which the authority to judge accuracy and completeness is distributed among multiple knowledge holders. The errors that individual human memory inevitably introduces are caught and corrected through the social mechanisms of the ceremonial life. This is not intuition or superstition. It is, in essence, a sophisticated information management system, a system that has been refined over tens of thousands of years to solve one of the most challenging problems that any culture faces: how to preserve specific, accurate information across spans of time that exceed the life of any individual, any generation, any institution. Western culture solved this problem, to a significant degree, with writing. The written record can preserve information with high fidelity across many generations, independently of the mortality of the individuals who created it. But writing has its own vulnerabilities. Libraries burn, scripts become unreadable, languages die, The written record of ancient civilizations has been massively disrupted by the physical fragility of its medium and the cultural disruption of the civilizations that created it. The Aboriginal Australian oral tradition, by contrast, has been operating continuously for 65,000 years without a break. It has survived every change in the Australian climate. It has survived the extinction of the megafauna. It has survived the rising of the seas at the end of the last ice age. It survived 2 centuries of the most intense and deliberate cultural suppression that the British colonial project could bring to bear. And it is still here, still carrying the information, still connecting the present to the deep past in ways that no written tradition anywhere in the world can match. This is an achievement of staggering magnitude. It deserves to be recognized as such. Not as a curiosity, not as an interesting cultural fact, but as one of the greatest intellectual and cultural achievements in the history of the human species. The preservation of accurate, specific, practically valuable knowledge across 65,000 years, through the use of social and mnemonic technologies that were developed and refined over that same span of time, is not a minor thing. It is a demonstration of what human culture can accomplish when it is given enough time and enough commitment and enough relationship with the place it inhabits. And now, let us come to the specific thing that sits at the center of all of this. The thing that connects the deep past of the Outback to the immediate present. The thing that makes the story of what scientists have found buried in the Australian Outback not just historically interesting, but urgently, practically relevant. The knowledge is endangered. The traditions that have been preserving this extraordinary archive for 65,000 years are under pressure. The elders who hold the most specific and most detailed knowledge are aging. The processes of cultural transmission that would normally pass that knowledge to the next generation have been disrupted by 2 centuries of colonization. The languages in which much of the most precise knowledge is encoded, languages that have no written form and that have only ever been transmitted orally, are dying, some are already gone. Every time an elder dies without having passed on their specific knowledge of their country, a piece of the archive is lost. Not just a cultural loss, though it is certainly that, a scientific loss. A loss of information about the history of the Earth and the history of life and the history of our species that exists nowhere else and that cannot be reconstructed from any other source. The recognition of this loss and of the urgency of acting to prevent as much of it as possible is driving a wave of documentation and language revitalization work that is among the most important cultural and scientific work being done anywhere in Australia today. Linguists and anthropologists and ecologists are working with knowledge holders across the continent to record and preserve as much as possible of the traditions that are at risk. But documentation alone is not the solution. A tradition that exists only in an archive, only in recordings and transcripts, is not a living tradition. It cannot continue to develop and refine itself. It cannot continue to be tested against the world and corrected when it errs. It cannot generate new knowledge or integrate new experience. A documented tradition is a taxidermied specimen, preserved in form, but no longer alive. The solution is not just documentation, but revitalization. The support of the conditions under which the living tradition can continue to be transmitted in the normal way, from knowledge holders to the next generation, in the context of living in relationship with country. This requires Aboriginal Australians to have access to their country. It requires the social and ceremonial structures within which knowledge is transmitted to be maintained or rebuilt where they have been disrupted. It requires the next generation to have the opportunity to participate in the traditions that will one day be their responsibility to carry. It requires, in short, the recognition that Aboriginal cultures are not relics of the past, but living systems whose continuation is essential, not just to the communities that hold them, but to the broader human enterprise of understanding ourselves and our world. The things buried in the Australian Outback are extraordinary. The things that are still alive, the living traditions and the living knowledge, and the living relationship between the Aboriginal peoples and their country are no less extraordinary, and they are more fragile. They require active support and active partnership and active recognition of their value in order to survive and continue. The scientists who have been finding extraordinary things buried in the Outback are increasingly recognizing this. The collaboration between Western science and Aboriginal knowledge is growing. The understanding that these 2 traditions, for all their differences, are engaged in the same fundamental enterprise of understanding the world is becoming more widely shared, but there is still much to be done. And the window for doing it is not unlimited. The urgency is real. The loss that is happening is real. And the opportunity to prevent more of it by taking the right actions now is also real. What scientists have found buried in the Australian Outback has shocked the entire world. But the most important thing they have found is not something buried at all. It is something alive, something that has been alive for 65,000 years, something that is more threatened now than it has ever been, and that requires more active support now than it has ever required. The living knowledge of country, the living traditions of the oldest continuous culture on Earth, the living connection between the Aboriginal Australians and the most ancient landscape on the surface of the planet. This is what the Outback contains that is most precious. This is what the discoveries point toward. Not just the sediments and the genes and the rocks and the bones, though all of those things are extraordinary and all of them matter, but the living people and the living culture and the living knowledge that has been maintained in relationship with this landscape across a span of time that no other human culture anywhere in the world can match. They are still here. That is the most extraordinary discovery of all. They are still here. And the world is finally, imperfectly, partially, beginning to understand what that means. We are, as a species, learning to read the archive that the Australian Outback represents. We are developing the tools and the partnerships and the humility that are necessary to understand what it is telling us. We are beginning to grasp the scale of what has been preserved here and the scale of what has been at risk of being lost. The red earth is patient, the ancient rocks are patient, the stars that have looked down on this landscape for billions of years are patient. The knowledge encoded in the traditions and the genes and the oral histories of the people who have been here for 65,000 years is patient. But we should not take that patience for granted. We should not assume that because the archive has survived this long, it will continue to survive regardless of what we do or fail to do. The world is changing, the climate is changing, the cultures are changing, the pressures are intensifying. The time for taking this knowledge seriously, for supporting the communities that hold it, for building the collaborations that can bring it into dialogue with the scientific tradition, for doing the work that needs to be done, that time is not unlimited. It is now. It has always been now. The Australian Outback is waiting. The stories are waiting, the knowledge is waiting, the archive is open if we know how to read it and who to ask. What scientists have found buried in the Australian Outback has shocked the entire world. Now the world needs to decide what to do about it, not in the abstract, not as a philosophical question, but practically, specifically, in the laboratories and the lecture halls and the government offices and the community meetings and the collaborative field work and the language programs and the fire management projects and all the thousand specific places where the decision about how to relate to this knowledge has to be made day by day, one choice at a time. The discovery is not the end of the story. It is not even the middle. It is the beginning. And the beginning, if we are wise enough to recognize it and act on it, could be the beginning of something extraordinary, something that serves not just the communities whose knowledge and whose country are at the center of this story, but all of us, the entire human species, facing the challenges of the present with the resources of the deep past available to us for the first time in the history of the encounter between the Western tradition and the most ancient culture on Earth. The Outback is waiting. Are we ready to listen? The stars say yes, the red earth says yes. The 65,000 years say yes. Now we breathe, now we rest. Now we let the immensity of what we have been discussing settle into us like the slow accretion of sediment at the bottom of an ancient lake. Layer by layer, quietly, over time. The information is all there, the evidence is all there. The story is all there, waiting to be told in full, waiting for the tools and the partnerships and the will to reveal its full depth. We have heard some of it tonight. A fraction, a beginning, an opening. The rest is out there in the red earth and the ancient rocks and the living traditions and the stars that have been watching over all of it for longer than we can fully comprehend. Go gently now into the remainder of the night. Let the stories breathe. Let the knowledge settle. Let the depth of what the Australian Outback contains be present in you, not as a burden, not as an obligation, but as a gift. The gift of deep time. The gift of knowing that you're part of something far larger and far older and far more extraordinary than any one life can contain. The gift of being, however briefly, in conversation with 65,000 years of human life on the most ancient continent on Earth. That conversation does not need to end when the voice stops. It continues in the quiet, in the space between waking and sleeping, in the place where the mind lets go of the need to analyze and understand and simply allows itself to be present to the immensity of what is. The Australian Outback is still out there. The stars are still out there. The 65,000 years are still present in everything the earth of that ancient continent contains. And you're still here, in the late hours, having made this long journey through deep time and wide space, carrying with you now some small additional piece of the archive that the Outback represents. That is enough. That is more than enough. It is, in its own quiet way, extraordinary. Rest now. The Outback is patient, and so is the night. But before the night closes completely, there are a few more things worth sitting with. A few more threads in this tapestry that deserve to be drawn out and examined in the quiet that we are in now, in the hours when the thinking mind slows and the other kind of knowing becomes available. Let us talk about what it feels like to stand in a place that is this old, not the abstract statistical oldness of numbers and dates and geological epochs, the felt oldness of standing on ground that has been inhabited by human beings for 65,000 years, and feeling that time in the ground beneath your feet. People who have spent time in remote parts of the Australian outback, in places far from the roads and the tourist infrastructure and the interpretive signs that translate the landscape for outside visitors, often describe an experience that does not have a clear name in the scientific vocabulary, a sense of presence, of something that is not just physical, of the landscape having a quality that is different from the quality of landscapes in other parts of the world, as if the length of the human relationship with this place has left something in the air and the earth that can be felt as well as measured. This is not supernatural. It is not mysticism in any dismissive sense. It is something real, though hard to quantify. The experience of being in a place where the relationship between human culture and natural environment has been developing and deepening for an unimaginably long period of time, where the landscape has been named and storied and sung and managed and mourned and celebrated and known in ways so profound and so sustained that the knowing has itself become part of the place, where the human relationship with country is itself a feature of the landscape, as present as the rocks and the sky and the long red distances. Researchers who have had the opportunity to spend time in the outback in partnership with Aboriginal knowledge holders, learning to see the landscape through the frameworks that those knowledge holders carry, often describe their experience in terms of a radical expansion of what they can perceive. A rock formation that to the untrained eye is simply a rock formation becomes, in the context of the tradition that has been knowing it for thousands of years, a node in a network of meaning and relationship and story that extends across the landscape in all directions and back through time as far as the tradition can reach. This is not romanticization. This is a genuine epistemic experience. The landscape contains more information than any single framework can extract. The geological lens sees one set of things, the ecological lens sees another, the astronomical lens sees another. The lens of the oral tradition and the ceremonial geography sees another still. And when all of these lenses are brought to bear simultaneously, in genuine collaboration and genuine dialogue, what becomes visible is something that no single tradition could have seen alone. The Australian outback is a place where this convergence is possible in a way that it is possible almost nowhere else, where the depth of the indigenous knowledge tradition, the extraordinary antiquity and continuity of the relationship between the Aboriginal peoples and their country, meets the technical capabilities of modern science in ways that are producing genuinely new understanding. The discoveries that have been made in the Australian outback over recent decades are not the culmination of this convergence. They are the beginning of a new kind of science, a new kind of knowing that takes the full range of human epistemic traditions seriously and that tries to bring them into productive dialogue with each other. What that dialogue will produce over the coming decades is not yet knowable, but the trajectory is clear, and the direction it is pointing is toward a richer, deeper, more complete understanding of the Australian continent and its history, and through that, of the human story and the Earth's story in their full depth and complexity. The outback is ready, the knowledge is there, the archive is open. The question, as always, is whether we are ready to receive it, whether we are willing to do the slow, careful, humble, relational work that genuine understanding requires. Whether we can resist the temptation of the quick answer and the simple narrative and the comfortable category, and sit instead with the complexity and the strangeness and the extraordinary depth of what the Australian outback actually contains. The scientists who have been making the discoveries we have been discussing tonight have, for the most part, been willing to do that work. The results speak for themselves. Each new finding that emerges from the red earth of the outback is more astonishing than the last. Each new analysis reveals more layers, more complexity, more connections, more depth than the previous one. And each new finding is an invitation to understand ourselves differently, to locate ourselves in a longer story, to recognize in the deep past of the Australian continent something that is not foreign or exotic or merely historical, but something that speaks to our present and our future in ways that we are only beginning to articulate. The red earth of the outback has been patient for a very long time. It will be patient a little longer, but the time to listen, really listen to what it is saying, is not in the indefinite future. It is now. In the silence of this late hour, in the space that opens up when the noise of the day recedes and the deeper frequencies become audible. In the morning, there will be more discoveries, more papers, more findings, more pieces of the puzzle. The archive is still open. The Outback is still yielding its secrets. The scientists are still finding extraordinary things buried in the red earth of the world's most ancient inhabited continent. And the story that those findings are telling is still being assembled, still being understood, still being absorbed into the larger narrative of who we are and where we came from and what we are capable of. But for now, in this hour, the story is enough. It is more than enough. It is 65,000 years of human life on the most ancient continent on Earth. It is the oldest known astronomical traditions, the oldest known mortuary ritual, the oldest known oral memories, the oldest known surviving human genetic lineages. It is the 3 billion-year-old traces of the first life, preserved in ancient rocks beneath a sky that has never stopped watching over them. It is the living knowledge of 65,000 years, encoded in traditions that have outlasted every other continuous human cultural record on the surface of the planet. It is the Australian Outback, and what has been found buried within it has not just shocked the entire world. It has, for those willing to hear it, changed it. The night is deep and the stars are very bright, and the red earth is ancient beneath us all. Rest now in the knowledge that the world is older and stranger and more extraordinary than we were ever told. Rest now with the 65,000 years. Rest now with the deep time. The archive is still open. The story is still being told, and there will be more to discover. There is always more. There is something that happens in the middle of a long night, in the middle of a long conversation with deep time, that is difficult to describe, but that is recognizable once it has been experienced. A kind of loosening, a release of the ordinary grip of the day's concerns. The specific anxieties and preoccupations and tasks and identities that fill the waking hours begin to soften at their edges. They do not disappear, but they become, for a time, a little less pressing, a little less immediate. And in the space that opens when they recede, something else can enter. The sense of scale, the sense of how large the world actually is, and how long it has been here, and how many lives have been lived in it, and how much has been accomplished and lost and preserved and rediscovered and accomplished again in the vast span of time that human beings have been inhabiting this planet. The Australian Outback and the story we have been telling tonight about what scientists have found buried within it is one of the most powerful possible invitations to that sense of scale. Because everything about it is vast. The landscape is vast. The geological record is vast. The biological archive is vast. The cultural tradition is vast. The genetic lineage is vast. Even the questions that the discoveries raise are vast, reaching backward into the deep past and forward into the uncertain future with equal force and equal urgency. To sit with all of that vastness is not to be overwhelmed by it. It is to be placed within it, to find your location in something that is much larger than you, and to discover in that locating a kind of peace that is different from the peace of resolution or the peace of having found answers. It is the peace of recognizing that the questions are ancient and that they have been asked before, and that the asking itself is part of what it means to be human. Every person who has ever looked up at the stars from the red earth of the Australian Outback has felt something of what you might be feeling now if you have been traveling with this story through the hours of the night. The weight of time, the dignity of age, the strange comfort of knowing that the world has been here long before you arrived and will be here long after you're gone, and that the time between your arrival and your departure, however brief it may seem against the backdrop of 65,000 years or 3.5 billion years, is yours. Entirely, completely, unmistakably yours. The Aboriginal Australians who have been the custodians of this landscape for the whole of that 65,000 years have a concept of belonging to country rather than owning it. Country is not something you possess. It is something you belong to, something that holds you as much as you hold it, something that has obligations toward you and toward which you have obligations in return. In this framework, the human relationship with the land is not one of dominance or exploitation or extraction. It is one of reciprocity, of mutual dependence, of an ongoing conversation in which both parties, the human beings and the country they belong to, are constantly speaking and constantly listening. The things buried in the Australian Outback, the bones and the ochre and the tools and the DNA, and the ancient rocks and the fossil life and the underground water and all the rest of it, are not just scientific data, they are part of that conversation. They are what country has been saying to the human beings who belong to it for 65,000 years. And they are what those human beings have said back in the marks they have made on stone, and in the traditions they have maintained, and in the care they have taken of the landscape, and in the genetic archive preserved in their cells. It is a conversation that the rest of the world is only now beginning to overhear. And what we are hearing, if we listen carefully enough, is extraordinary. It is the sound of a 65,000-year relationship between human beings and the natural world, carried on in a spirit of reciprocity and respect and sustained attention, leaving behind it a record of extraordinary depth and richness and significance. That is the real discovery. Not any single site or artifact or genetic finding or astronomical tradition, though all of those things are extraordinary in themselves. The real discovery is the relationship, the 65,000-year conversation between the Aboriginal Australians and their country. The record it has left in the landscape and in the culture and in the human genome, the knowledge it has produced and preserved, the demonstration it provides of what human beings can be and do and know and remember when they are given enough time and enough commitment and enough relationship with the place they call home. This is what scientists have found buried in the Australian Outback. And it has shocked the entire world, not because it is alien, but because it is deeply, profoundly, recognizably human. All of us carry somewhere in our cells and our stories and our most fundamental ways of being in the world the memory of a time when the relationship between human beings and the natural world was more immediate, more reciprocal, more sustained than it is for most of us today. The Aboriginal Australians, in maintaining that relationship across 65,000 years, have preserved something that the rest of the world has largely lost, and in preserving it, they have given us something extraordinary, a mirror in which to see ourselves as we might have been, and as we might again aspire to be. That is the gift of the Australian Outback, the gift of deep time, the gift of the oldest continuous culture on Earth, the gift of 65,000 years of human relationship with the most ancient inhabited landscape on the planet. Accept it gently, carry it lightly, let it rest in you through the remainder of this long night, and through all the nights that follow. The red Earth is ancient, the stars are bright, the 65,000 years are present, and you're here at this late hour, having made this long journey through the deep past and the wide world, carrying within you now some small piece of what the Australian Outback has been holding for all this time. That is enough. That is everything. The story continues, it always does. There is a quality to the silence of the deep Australian night that you do not find anywhere else. It is a silence that is not simply the absence of sound. It is an active silence. A silence with presence. A silence that has been here in this form for so long that it has become something almost tangible, almost like a substance in itself. The silence of 65,000 years of human habitation, of a place where the modern world's noise has not yet fully penetrated, where the stars are still the dominant feature of the night sky, where the earth still speaks in its own voice, undisrupted by the constant low roar of the contemporary world. To hear that silence, even through the medium of a voice speaking in the dark, is to be brought into contact with something rare, something that most of the world's people will never experience directly, because most of the world's people live in places where that quality of silence no longer exists, where it was displaced long ago by the sounds of civilizations building themselves upon each other in layers of stone and steel and glass. The Australian Outback still has that silence, still has that quality of ancient presence, still has the capacity to return a human being to something like their original relationship with the earth and the sky and the depth of time. That is the final thing that scientists have found buried in the Australian Outback, not a substance that can be analyzed or a date that can be measured or a genetic sequence that can be read, something more elusive and more essential. Proof that such silence still exists. Proof that such depth still exists. Proof that such ancientness still exists. Somewhere on this earth, in the red and the vast and the old, there is still a place where the full weight of human time can be felt, and the full depth of human knowledge can be held, and the full span of what it means to be a creature who thinks and wonders and remembers and belongs to a particular piece of the earth can be experienced. That is the Australian Outback. That is what has been found buried within it. And it is, in every sense of the word, extraordinary.